Oh, okay.
All right. Well, we're back again, and the world is completely insane. So, Comrade Commissar Cuomo is working on, well, what would we say? Containment camps, a place to make you free with work?
They are a place where we can help people who need to concentrate on how awesome the Democrats are.
Let's just put it like this: he's learning from Shinny Jinping how to do things. They're not, detention facilities. They're concentration camps to help people concentrate. Well, I heard there's a suggestion to rename New York City to New Xinjiang City.
I don't think so.
Or maybe New Dachau or New Auschwitz.
I'm going with New Dachau. New Dachau is probably pretty solid. We should have just blown the bridges a long time ago. That's really what it comes down to.
So we were just saying, your COVID cards might have 6 points on them, and you might need to wear them on your sleeve. Papers, please.
It is.
Make
possible.
sure that you have your papers out when you're entering and exiting the ghettos.
As a matter of fact, you can't get off a plane into New York without showing your papers.
We can
Literally
debate whether the vaccine is, arranged by all these people who are, have not necessarily the best motives at heart in general when they most often speak, but at least we know that New York is going to be first in making sure that you are credentialed to travel and you have your papers to go where you need to go, and you'll get to wear a badge. It'll be
a cool gold star for everybody.
It'll be a really cool gold star.
Well,
you know what's
what
really
you get
funny?
to do? You get yourself a selfie when you get your shot, and then nurses will dance around you.
Oh,
and
yes.
You can put that video up on your fucking Instagram.
Yeah, you'll get all kinds of likes.
Have that shit out.
Oh,
you have that shit out when you walk past the security guard.
You know what? I can't believe that. So my wife thinks, because she's into TikTok, she's like, I think this is perfectly fine and there's nothing wrong with it. I'm like, these motherfuckers are constantly complaining about how overworked they are in one
I gotta
segment.
help her out with that. No. I gotta help out with that. The nurses that are doing all this TikTok bullshit, many of them are not in the COVID areas. These are the people who basically lost hours because their shit got shut down to make space. So I can totally get that they're going to be bored out of their fucking mind. But at the same time, they're wearing the same exact scrubs as all the people who are bitching about having hours because they do have the hours.
But,
so when they go out there and do this shit, they make all of them look stupid.
Either way, right? Either we, I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you.
Very charitable, Craig.
I very much agree with what Craig's saying. There are distinctions between the hospitals that are getting slammed and the hospitals that aren't. But either way, what we're talking about is a functional, state level issue in resource distribution and patient distribution. If they have that much fucking time.
No. Like I say, look, it's not that. It's that there are. Okay, so if you have nurses that are specially trained to work for infants, for example. They work in the neonatal ICU or the NICU. You don't put adult-sized patients in the NICU. So if you have an influx of adult patients that take resources from the NICU and you've basically shut down that ward for a lot of the different things that are going on, like you don't have a lot of the elective shit that's going on, you're going to have NICU nurses that are just kind of hanging out. This is a bad example because the NICU is usually pretty staffed and pretty full. But that specialization distinction exists for a lot of different things. For instance, if you have and this is on the doctor level, not the nurse level, but this is easier to just say outright. You're not going to find a lot of dermatologists doing ICU work to take care of COVID patients. It's just not.
I agree, but at the same time, we are still talking about the fundamental training that allows the swap of these resources between one group and another. So turning around and saying, oh, well, the NICU unit is, and I'm just using your example. Again, I know NICU is
it's a bad example.
It's a bad example. Let's call it the ER department on a non-full moon night. Having worked in an ER department, there is a fundamental difference when there's a full moon and not. And I don't know what the hell's wrong with people. Goddamn werewolves. But there is a difference between that staffing, but at the same time, the training's the same. and the courses are the same. And so there's no reason that we can't take these divergent units and swap them around.
So there is and there isn't. What you do is you go for the people. So there's a time and a place is the kind of thing that's the problem here, because now we've had a fucking year. So now you're fundamentally getting to the point where you can say, yeah, I'm right. But we're not quite there yet. And training takes time, and the infectious control training for general staffing is not going to be sufficient for a scenario like this where you're doing quarantine areas. There's more to it. And while it doesn't take a year or months to do that kind of training, it doesn't. It takes time to find that time when other people are swamped doing other things. So in terms of resource allocation, the problem has been largely not having enough time to do stuff like that in order to generate the staffing that will allow them to repurpose. And while they have been able to keep up with so they carved out to get a higher surge capacity, and they've tried to keep up with the rise in the demand from having more people get infected. And that's all well and good, but there's only so much it's going to do before they get to the point where they have a problem with beds being done. So they've been trying to train out staff and get them to the point where they are interchangeable. But they can't do that if they turf them because the hour's been cut. For some reason, that's not an interchange they can do, and hospitals are losing money right now. This is not a winning fiscal strategy for them to have COVID patients.
Oh, absolutely, it's not a winning fiscal strategy.
So they don't have the resources. They don't have excess resources to do this kind of extra training and so on. They have to spend it usually on the PPE that's been massively overblown in cost because of all this shit, the shortages.
Oh, and speaking of PPE,
winter surge has consumed all kinds of resources.
Again, I'm not disagreeing with that, but this is actually something that comes up all the time. Even in my line of work, right, where I'm dealing with operations crews and ESH people who are ESH people.
Well, keep in mind, I have brought these things up in conversation with people I know. I'm not. This isn't just from a higher level perspective on all of this. It's part of this is from knowing. I won't say on the show here, but I can type it out or tell you later. People who are close enough for me to talk to routinely and ask about this kind of stuff.
I get that, but
this is where I know you have valid concerns here. I'm telling you that they are valid.
Right, what ends up happening, and this is what I've seen, and this is actually something that rings really close to me. Are we actually recording at this point? I'm just curious.
Oh, yeah, we're on.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I just wanted to make sure.
We just didn't do an intro.
Yeah, we did.
Just kind of dropped right into it.
Dove straight in.
By the way, all three of us are here this time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, we're all here.
This is amazing. This is amazing. We're not getting the me sock puppeting Craig over here and pretending to be two engineers. But so one of the things that I deal with in my department, and this is actually a war that I've been fighting personally where I work, there's always a group of people who are saying we need more training, right?
Yeah.
That is
exactly
something, and somebody turns around, right, and they turn around and they say we need more training, let's do something else other than training in the meantime, and what ends up happening is the training never gets done, right? So you end up churning a whole bunch of people to try to adapt to this untrained group, rather than putting together a very quick presentation and throwing them in the mix and hoping they get caught up to speed.
Let me cynically throw another layer on top of that for you.
Sure.
It's not just that that's been going on. It's also that COVID-specific training obviously didn't exist before it came along.
But that's
and
the
then
point, right?
Development. That's why I was saying. Now that there's been a freaking year, that's definitely been developed by now.
But at the same time, right? So the argument is, well, we don't have the time to train these people, and we have this learned experience. But guess what? Those same people that you don't have that have the time to sit there and pretend to be rowing a boat, you can just throw them into the thick of it, and they can get the training on the job. Right? There's no reason that we can't just throw bodies at the problem.
Now.
I don't think so. It's no worse than
practically
right now.
It's not, but
That is such
for like OSHA
dude, look
and
at the
all
way,
the fucking HIPAA shit that would be related to that, that would
look
be
at the
amazing.
way
HIPAA just
asbestos.
protects patients.
Look at the way asbestos, like, just, and this is another bad example, but just look at the way asbestos came out.
Be very careful, Craig. I am all asbestos. I have
Like,
got
no,
all the certifications.
That's what I'm saying. Like, look at the way that the asbestos fallout landed over the next couple of decades. People paid attention in the insurance industry. Like, this is one of those moments where hospitals are just like, we need people, and you can guarantee there's a lawyer who said no. They need to be trained.
Well, it's not really, though.
Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
That's not how the asbestos stuff ends up working out, right? So to give you an idea of how the actual asbestos breaks down.
What I mean is,
right?
would someone put asbestos in a building now?
Well, it's been outlawed since like 1984, so probably not.
Right.
That being said,
absent an outlawing of the fucking industry.
Actually, you know what? If they hadn't outlawed it, it wouldn't surprise me if they would, because they can make some pretty good fire retardant material with it. They would probably not put TSI up anymore, and they probably TSI is thermal systems insulation, so that's like the fibery stuff that would wrap your heat pipes. But they would probably put it into a bunch of different like materials that are kind of inert, sheetrock, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
They'd probably still have it in brakes. Because
certainly.
that actually, like, the switch away from asbestos ended up resulting in your brake changes have to happen much more frequently because the alternative materials are not as heat resistant as asbestos is. And so I mean, I think that we still would have used it. Same with PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, but for those people who don't know, all of these things, the reason that we don't use them anymore is that the reason that they are bad for humans is the same reason that they were good for use in society. They basically are inert, right, to everything.
You see, the way you said that before you said the basically they're inert. Because then there'd be less people.
So it's fundamentally true. Like the problem with asbestos is not the asbestos itself. It's your body's reaction to it and your body's utter inability to break it down. And so your immune system keeps on attacking this fiber, which doesn't give a shit. It just kind of hangs out there, and there's nothing you can do about it. So
another good example of that would be another good example of that is if you ingest like an idiot oxalic acid, the buildup of the calcium oxalate in your kidneys. And don't give no shits about anything coming in to attack it.
Yep.
It just hangs out as a crystal, and your body just gets more and more angry.
Yep. And that's pretty much that's what ends up happening for like asbestos and stuff like that. So, I mean, it's very, very interesting. It is wonderful as a thermal insulator. It's probably one of the best fire barriers you have. And in fact, there is a king from way back in the day, because we've used asbestos forever and a day. Right, yep. I think it was Pliny the Elder, so way back in the ancient Greeks, right? Pliny the Elder noted that the asbestos miners seem to have short little happy lives in comparison to their non-asbestos miner counterparts.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like,
very short.
Like coal miners before there were any regulations.
Yeah, it's.
Or the coal burners were the bad ones. The cokers, those are the guys who would load up all the wood and then pack that shit with clay and just stare at that thing as it burned day and night to make sure that they got the mix right. And then they'd have to dive in face first into this mountain of black shit to pull it out for you.
Yeah.
To have charcoal.
Yep. And that's like, I mean, so like we've known that it's hazardous for a while, but to give you an idea, there was a king, and I can't remember what the guy's name is. But it is presumed, based on historical accounts, that he had custom made for him an asbestos-like napkin, right? And so as a party trick, he would eat his dinner with his guests, wipe his face with a napkin, and then throw it in the fire. And everybody was like, ooh, ah. And it wouldn't burn, which would make all of these, 12th century goat herders.
I have great powers. Behold my magic scarf.
And then he'd pull it out, and it'd be perfectly fine, and he'd just wipe the ash off, rinse it off in water, and he'd have a clean asbestos napkin again. So it's really good stuff for, like, non-human related things.
Unfortunately, it usually gets used in society where humans are.
That is a small oversight and a problem that, but at the same time, I don't think when you start looking at like asbestos regs, going back to the core issue that we were talking about,
right.
When we start talking like asbestos regs, the risks associated with asbestos are significantly different than the risks associated with COVID.
Sure. So my point basically was like, would a lawyer today, supposing asbestos were relevant and legal in other industries, would a lawyer today say that without having like the proper training for your crew doing installations, they go ahead and do it?
They would. I mean, when you start talking about what asbestos training is, New York's pretty rigorous, but there's not a lot of requirements.
Better yet, say there's a cleanout crew. So there's a crew that goes in and takes out asbestos. This is a better example because it's actually legal. And say that you have just like only a couple crews that are trained in asbestos, and you're like, the other ones can learn on the job. The lawyer is probably going to step in and say, "Are you sure you want to do that?"
Well, see, not really. I mean, like asbestos is pretty simple, and so at the end of the day, you say that, right? And I also know that there's a lot of crews out there that don't really pay attention to the regs, anyways, and their foremen get the shit kicked out of them.
And this is all corollary to what we're trying to discuss with the nurses.
Right. But I do think that when we start talking about something like COVID, right, I think that you could, when we're starting to talk about like an asbestos worker, you are talking about the roughly, a homeless person coming in off the street, right? If you turned around, let's say a bad example. Right, exactly. So if we were to talk about, say, I guess the comparative and the parallel would be, do you think that if your pool of people to throw into your asbestos work were formally trained IH professionals, right, your ESH professionals, do you think a lawyer would take that? And the answer is, I think most lawyers would accept that because they have a general understanding of the risk of working with this stuff, right? Like,
so what they really rely on.
I'm sure nurses are familiar with germ theory.
So you have to understand, like, these medical lawsuits are huge. The settlements coming out of them are they're basically lifetime payouts.
Yeah, many millions.
Oh yeah.
So the main they are extremally phobic of this kind of shit, and so what they really rely on is basically paperwork cover your ass kind of lawyering. So if you don't have the right training to do something, they will stop you if they know about it.
I suppose.
Now, COVID being a thing may or may not have been a part of that, but if there is any kind of COVID-specific training, it's definitely been developed by now. Is what I was trying to get across. Like, even if that was a restriction from earlier, when those TikTok videos were more popular, I guess, back in like March and April and shit, or in the middle of the summer.
Yep.
If it was a hindrance back then that the training did not exist, it wasn't developed, that restriction is gone now. So these TikTok
Why are they still making TikTok videos?
These TikTok nurses need to go the fuck away. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I entirely agree. I guess it ends up upsetting me when you see these people sitting there and saying, "Oh my God, I'm overwhelmed." I'm not doubting that those people exist, but then to turn around and have all these people playing like coordinated choreographed dances, you're like, maybe you should go where there's work. Maybe we should appropriately prioritize the resources.
Good optics. Like, really not good optics.
You have to consider it from their perspective. And this isn't like why they should do the videos. This is the downstream. They don't like see all the outrage, and generally speaking, if you're bored off your ass, you do something goofy, and you're just like, hey, this is funny, and then you go about your business. You're not out there seeing all the people who are screaming at their phones in frustration, going, "Why the fuck are you doing this? If all the hospitals are full, why am I seeing this shit?" Without any context, of course. You have to keep in mind, that's the other thing. There's a big gap in knowledge there in both directions.
Absolutely.
Like, the nurses don't know how stupid they look. I mean, well, at some level they have to, but they don't know how stupid they look to the public. And then the public doesn't know what specialty they're in, if that's a factor in them having free time.
And all of that's true. But I also think that they did a lot of damage to their credibility.
Oh, they certainly did.
With the Black Lives Matter protests, where they were starting to turn around and say who could and could not go out.
So what pissed me off about that was of the 600 quote healthcare professionals, because by the way, it wasn't 600 doctors. That can be very clear right now. There was maybe 100 or 200 doctors that were in that 600. Two of the people that were on that fucking list.
Maybe some of them were doctors of education.
Right. Two of the people on that fucking list were goddamn journalists.
Are you serious?
I'm serious.
There you go, doctors of journalism.
Right. So, that doesn't mean that 500 of them were journalists. That means 2 of them were. But again, it wasn't all doctors. It was healthcare professionals. They were very careful to say that and then heavily imply that they were fucking doctors. So it wasn't 600 doctors. It was 600, quote, healthcare professionals, which is a vague enough get out of jail free card that they managed to get past a whole bunch of bullshit with that. Like, yeah, that means that you can go out there and fucking kneel down and put your hand up for fucking COVID or whatever. Black lives are more important during COVID. There you go.
Well, I mean, when you sit there and you start talking about any time, just to our listeners, our brilliant and beautiful listeners, anytime somebody sits there and gathers a whole bunch of signatures in something and says, "Hey, look at this really significant thing. There's this many signatures," you should just assume it's bullshit. Because there's millions and millions of people that could sign that, and they were only able to get X hundred.
I was going to say, you should assume that there are a couple orders of magnitude more people who didn't give a shit.
Mm-hmm.
Actively didn't give a shit.
Mm-hmm.
That's generally a safe assumption.
And then there was a 3,000 doctor or whatever thing that was like the other direction, saying, "Why are you allowing this shit?"
Mm-hmm.
It's all theater, but of course the only 600 signatures got the fucking press time.
No, of course it did.
But it's ridiculous to me. Yeah, it's like that nonsense needs to get knocked off. And that's not the only way they lost their credibility. It's also like getting the one fucking nurse who they knew would faint. Shot on TV. Like, she has a history of fainting when she gets shots, which is a real phenomenon. And she just gets the shot on TV like she's gonna be the normal one. Why
this is the person you choose?
Or what about
the guy who chose her? It's that she agreed to it, knowing this shit would happen.
What about when they turned around and they injected the guy with a used needle? Because that's a really great look.
Or the fucking the guy the sec def guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who got the fucking shot and they had no tip on the 1 mil needle.
Yep.
It was not a retractable needle because there's a big difference between them. Because now, if you looked at just the end of the thing and you said, okay, it could be a needle there because of JPEG artifacts. Mm-hmm. No. The reason why no is that it doesn't have the little locking mechanism above where it would lock in. Mm-hmm. That would have the spring that pulls the needle back in for the auto retract needles.
Yep.
It clearly had some fluid inside of it, but it was probably just water from a cup. Like, if they're not, if they're gonna be doing, like, they're not using those auto retract things for any of the government officials anyway. They're just gonna use whatever's on hand, which is gonna be a diabetes injector, which is a separate needle. It has a lure lock and a smooth bore that it slips right onto for a slip fit.
But I think at the end of the day, the point is that the healthcare industry has completely and totally punctured any form of credibility that they have. And that when they sit there and they turn around and do this fun and game shit, they just don't come across as professionals.
It's not just that though. It's also all the people around them that are screaming, like, the party of science kind of bullshit. Trust the science, trust the healthcare professionals, trust the doctors, and then they do the opposite of what they're fucking supposed to do. Go out and have a big ass riot.
Mm-hmm.
And then the politicians
or meet up with all your friends for a nice dinner at one of the restaurants you didn't close.
And all the politicians who are just telling you you're a fucking asshole, you're an idiot, you don't care about other people because you went outside and had your fucking cigarette or whatever. They're the ones who turn around and then do all the same bullshit. They justify all this shit by saying these 600 people, not doctors, people. Some of which are doctors, granted, but these 600 people said that it's okay to go outside and protest racism.
Yep.
But not here where all the Republicans live. Like that kind of shit. It sounds cynical and stupid. That's because it is.
Yep.
It's all. They didn't take the shit seriously. They thought they'd never be in their position to get it. And then when you look at what happens when politicians do get it, every time it's a Republican, that fucker deserved it. Every time it's a Democrat, oh, I hope he gets better. This is the worst tragedy.
I mean,
if you say anything bad about him.
A perfect example of that. The absolutely most perfect example is the Republican that died just recently. They were saying that he didn't wear a mask.
Yeah, and then
it turns out the guy actually he died of a heart attack during surgery.
Well,
I thought it was after surgery.
It was post procedure, and it was post procedure, and he had an MI, but it's very likely that it was disease related. There's more than twice the risk of getting an MI if you have COVID.
That is one of those things where when we start counting these deaths, and I actually somebody wanted to debate this with me, and that's fine. They have a different perspective than I do. When we start counting these things and how we actually go about accounting for these things, if you die as a result of your surgery, even if that surgery was caused by another condition, we would still blame the surgery. Right. It's whoever had the last hands on the car is the one who's responsible for the fact that the parts failed.
Right, but the fact was that he was post-op. You know, he was post-procedure and he was recovering, and he had an MI.
But I mean,
that easily could have been something that was. It could have been that someone punched a hip and he had an embolism or whatever.
Right.
No, the fact remains that he had an MI. It wasn't during a procedure. It was after procedure. He had other conditions, and when they put things down and when the coroners do a report, let's use George Floyd as a fun example. When they did,
which report do you want to use? Do you want to use the one that actually sat there and looked at him, or the people who said they looked at a video and that was where they got their evidence?
Now, if you look at the report that looked at the toxicology too, you notice that everything's listed. It wasn't he died of fentanyl. It was he died and all this shit was in his system. You notice that with other coroner reports, the same exact thing's done every time you do a post-mortem. You're not going to get one cause of death. You're going to have a combination of things. Like, for instance, most people who die who have influenza, they don't, the cause of death that's listed causes of death that are listed are going to include influenza and whatever system failure occurred that caused them to die.
Right.
So you could easily go back and do the same exact, pulling the meat apart treatment if you want on all this kind of stuff. The fact remains that the guy had COVID, but he had a heart attack. That's ultimately what killed him was the heart failure.
Right.
But he had COVID, that probably caused the heart failure.
It was COVID. He'd cleared COVID. Then he went in for surgery, and then he had a heart attack, right?
So that's the thing. There is a long-term effect. Just to give you the statistic before you say something, there's more than a twofold increase in your heart attack risk, period, if you have COVID, to date that we know of. That includes people who have recovered and people who haven't recovered. That said, it's very much more likely that you're going to have that kind of coagulopathy during the actual infection, not afterwards.
Exactly.
Sure.
Well, I mean,
there you go. There's all the caveats thrown out there
there are a lot of caveats, but again, in general, when we talk about things, we talk about whoever had the hands on last. What was the last thing?
You could easily blame it on the surgeon or the surgery.
Well, not necessarily, right? Not necessarily, right?
You could say that it was an issue during post-op, a complication of the heart.
But I mean, to give a personal example, right? My dad had cancer. He had cancer for years. It was when they discovered it, it was stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It was glucogonoma. Now he decided to fight it all the way. He went into every obscure treatment trial that existed for and it actually worked out pretty well for him. And he managed to get it down to the point where they were going to do surgery. Right? And the surgeon told him straight out that he's willing to do the surgery because it could potentially save his life with an 80% chance of dying on the table.
Yeah.
Now they ended up not doing the surgery because there was it had already metastasized.
Yeah.
Which they found out at a later date, which kind of sucks, right? Because they could probably have. I would rather have had him have the 80% chance to take that out and then we go after the metastasis rather than just kill the options of a future. But 80% chance to die on the table. If he had gone in for the surgery and died, He would have died as a result of the surgery, in my perspective. Even though the cancer made it necessary to have the surgery, and the cancer was what was going to make it a risk.
Now,
right?
here's a way I would modify that to make it more relevant to the specific example we're dealing with the state senator, right, who died.
Yep.
So, just to make it more relevant, suppose that the cancer was located near was such that it was easy for him to get a bleed, and say that he went in for surgery, came out of surgery, was doing recovery and bled out.
Yep.
And say that before anybody had the completed autopsy results to find the bleed, or to see if it was disseminated or if it was like just at the surgical site, it was listed on the form as causes of death, complications during surgery, and cancer. That's more or less the state of the information that the public has on this.
And all of that's acceptable. I just know that, at least for me...
That seemed relevant, and does that seem like it's narrowed in enough?
I think that's a fair
Seems
point.
reasonable to me.
But to the issue at hand, right? The question is it COVID that killed the man? Well, It doesn't really look like it's COVID that killed the man. It looks like it's complications that were probably a result of surgery in a 41-year-old dude who was kind of a big guy. So
again, the end result is that what killed him was a myocardial infarct.
Right.
He had a heart attack and he died.
Yep.
So,
which is very likely after surgery.
COVID was present. A surgery happened. These are all things that are going to be listed under causes of death on the form. So, which thing actually did the? So it's very. I would say this. It's very rare for you to have your body just not fight a virus effectively enough, and your body just shuts down and you die purely from the virus. Usually, there's a specific system failure that can be pointed to.
I mean, and that's
so that
true.
will be listed on the form as a cause of death.
That's
and then
true,
other
but they
things will be listed.
They weren't performing the surgery with an active infection. He cleared the infection. Right. It looks like the surgery was probably required because of COVID, right? Sure. COVID had done some damage, or they either COVID had done some damage, or something had finally showed itself.
Well, so the reason I bring all this up is that people are going to say, and it's valid to bring this up from, and I'm not going to say from a point of ignorance, because people know enough that it's not entirely a point of ignorance, but it's kind of a knee-jerk thing to say, well, nobody's just dying from COVID, they're dying from other things. What happened to all these, there's a whole bunch of people that had heart attacks with COVID.
And if anybody's interested, I'm going to put a link to
had coagulopathy issues.
Follow up if you want to.
What's that?
I'm going to put a link to an article on this. It's actually kind of unbiased, so people can follow up with that if they want to.
Okay. So, but the point here is that there's a constellation of complications that come along with a disease like this that are going to be the actual cause of death. It's not going to be very common where they can't determine it, and it's going to be listed just as the disease.
Well, and all of that's true.
So when they say only 10% of the people have actually only died of COVID or whatever, this is the complication that they're running into. And this information asymmetry.
This is always an issue with comorbidities.
Right.
And fundamentally, this has been kind of a debate that you and I have had fairly extensively on this. At the end of the day, a lot of these things are people that were on their way out anyway. And,
sure, especially with the elderly. Yeah, absolutely.
Especially with the elderly. And so, yes, COVID, they died with COVID in their system, and yes, COVID exacerbated an underlying condition. So should we count that as a COVID death or not? Which goes back to us sitting there and saying, well, the final metric is going to be excess deaths, and the Johns Hopkins study found that there's been no excess deaths.
Well, so here's again where I'd point out this. If you have an elderly person who dies of the flu, or say they die of pulmonary failure, but they had the flu.
Yeah.
And they're in the hospital for the flu, and they died because basically their lungs gave out. The causes of death are going to include pulmonary failure and the flu on their chart. So if you go back and you do the same exact kind of treatment for the data when you look at stuff like the flu, you're going to have a whole slew of comorbidities that were involved.
Right.
And if you have to, this is a case of an apples to apples comparison. If you're going to say all these people die of the flu, and then we shouldn't worry about COVID, and then you're going to say, but not all these people, these people didn't all die of COVID, they had comorbidities. You can't have it both ways.
Well, and I don't think I've asked for it.
And you haven't done it that way, but I'm seeing this as a major argument that's made. When you start bringing up other diseases, they will treat the other disease in a completely different way when they're trying to have a discussion.
I see the way I see it is, again, that's why I think the metric of excess deaths, which again we aren't seeing excess deaths from COVID. The question comes down to sure. There's always complications. Everything that we talk about.
We actually I think the last time I was able to be on, I think it was actually before you came in the middle of it, because we had to do it early because family was still visiting.
It's entirely possible. So the 20th,
I was talking with Evan. I was talking with you, and we were covering the excess deaths, and I mentioned like a lot of these different other metrics that would kind of cancel out a little bit, and obviously it doesn't explain everything, yada yada, and there's kind of a gray area.
Right. Yeah.
But like this is the kind of thing that we're talking about here. If you have a study that says there weren't any changes in excess deaths, there's going to be a margin of error on this, and that margin might conceal the fuzziness of other factors at play.
But
we're going to have to wait for years. We're going to have to wait for probably several years to know. And this is what we always come down to an agreement on: is we have to wait in order to be able to actually determine the final outcome of this. Even like for 2020, we're not going to know until like 2022, 2023.
Maybe. It might even be longer than that.
We might have to wait until 2025 to really get a solid answer.
And if we're talking about long-term effects, all of these short-term studies come out, and this kind of shit shows up with every single pandemic that has ever hit the United States, right? They always do the same studies. It always has these additional health effects, and the actual long-term damage of COVID will be determined in the future. That's not to say me sitting there and saying that the long-term damage will be determined in the future is not me saying that I think there's going to be significant long-term damage in the future. I want to be very clear about that.
Right.
We are going to get a good handle on what it is years from now.
So that's part of the thing we were talking about earlier on in the fall. Actually, when we kind of started doing all this stuff, we were talking about these knock-on effects. Like the part of the reason to have the kind of paranoid response beyond trying to keep the thing under control is that we will not know until there's been enough time to know the knock-on effects, the downstream effects, these long-term or long COVID effects.
And that fundamentally comes down to the precautionary principle, and should we use that as guiding social principle? I disagree that it should be used as guiding social principle.
Well, there's acceptable risk for certain things, and you have your known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns.
Right.
And the thing is, there's
a lot of
basically
these come down to unknown
balance.
unknowns.
At the end of the day, when we're talking about risk, and this is the hard part, and this is actually the part. If you want to talk about the things that have pissed me off with COVID, it's the fact that we have not had our politicians, our leaders, getting up there and having and presenting an informed risk argument to the American populace.
Right.
Oh,
right.
Far from
this is if we were to talk about, like, Craig and I have on several occasions after the show been up for 6 hours debating various risk metrics.
We'll butt heads on things. But so here's the most important part of those discussions is all of the baseline facts. 99.99% of the baseline facts, we'll say, are agreed upon.
Yeah.
And a lot of it comes down to policy differences when we have our differences of opinion here.
Right.
And it's okay, because we both agree that these are personal decisions at the end of the fucking day.
They are.
Not the decision of some dick in a podium.
Androlf Quomler makes that decision for me every day.
You should be down here with Gus Santos, right?
I thank Mr. Quomler every day that I have not received my star and my paperwork. For when the train arrives at my house, I will be very sad.
Holy shit! Thank you, Androlf.
Work will make you free, sir. It really will.
Thank you, Androlf. You make my life brighter every day. Yeah, I will say
that.
One
he
TikTok,
makes it brighter by burning the stars.
There was one TikTok I saw, and it was. I'm not a huge fan of TikTok. My wife does it all the time. So
I call it TikTok.
Yeah, but so one guy sat there and he said, This is Andrew Cuomo every morning, right? And he just wakes up and he says, it appears God has allowed me to live another day, and I'm going to make it your problem. And I'm like, yeah, that is exactly what it's like to live in New York.
God damn, that sounds about right.
That sounds like the Cuomo we've all come to know and not love at all.
I like how DeSantis basically just tries to do as little as possible in that regard.
I would rather have a politician. I'd rather have a politician. What is it? When Bill Murray played a politician, right? All he did, his whole goal was to be left alone and collect a paycheck. I would love that politician. That would be the guy I'd vote back into office.
Like, I think politicians are all assholes. So, and also all liars. So if I was to go ahead and allow myself to be a liar for a day, I'd be happy to be a politician because I wouldn't do fucking shit. My goal is basically to promise everything and do absolutely nothing. It sounds about right for nowadays, but
Yeah, I mean, if you're doing that today, you're almost a good guy.
If I could take Androlf Cuomo's powers for a day, I would do one thing and one thing only, and that would be to collect and burn every single copy of Cry the Beloved Country that has ever been printed in this country, because that book should be burned out of existence. That is the only thing that I have. It is a private little wish.
So you show up and you take the book burner's job and immediately start burning books.
That's exactly right. If I had to be a politician, it'd only be one book, right? Oh, and I would require that every single hotel, if they want to put a Bible in their dresser, they also have to include a copy of Perry's.
No, a copy of Perry's and a copy of Atlas Shrugged.
Yes.
There you go.
Just so all the communists can get upset that they have Atlas Shrugged within a mile of them.
Every single hotel, if you want to have a copy of the Bible, you have to put a copy of Perry's.
You know what? I bet you the Gideons would actually be happy to put it in there too. If you know, just stamp on the front, Perry is God. Handed down from Perry, from the dear Lord.
And then we could have a nice progression, right? What the sheep herders believe the universe is contained in, what we've learned the universe actually is, and the philosopher's universe. There we'd have our three selections.
The only book that we're missing at that point is Kirk, so CRC, because that would actually provide you all the fundamental constants that you're missing.
That's true. But I mean, who honestly? Google will supply me with that for as long as...
You're going to say who honestly has a copy, and you know that I'm going to say yes, I have one.
I know. You know, I have a copy of Perry's digitally. I've been trying to sit there and see if the lab will subsidize additional books, but they've got a pretty tight policy on, addendum.
That's sad. I mean, well, if you have, a lab fund, you might see if, you can sort one out of that, but that as a desk reference, the digital copy, I love those, but at the same time, there's nothing for me that's faster than just having the fucking book and knowing where shit is, and then just going, flip, bam, I'm there. Oh, I'm off by one page. You know, it's so much faster if I have the book in front of me.
I mean, I can
That's
get
one of the
reasons
forget just how good it is to have physical media there. There are things you can just do with a book that you're...
Yeah.
We've also
just isn't something you can do unless we get holographic books.
Evan, I gotta stop you there, right? There is Control F, and Control F makes everything easier.
So this is true. Control F is faster than an index, but it is not.
There is an example. There is an example I can give, and this is the one I usually give for why, for instance, one, you'd have CRC, but two, even if you didn't, why you'd have so it's less relevant for periods, because who the fuck's doing longhand calculus in the middle of a fucking experiment? But
I am.
Right. So
most experiments are like watching paint dry.
Right.
So you might as well do longhand calculus.
So a good example of this is if I'm doing and this happened to me before. I have the actual book in the lab, and I would say I was doing nano work. I was in a fucking bunny suit, and we were doing extrusion, and I needed to look something up because I forgot it, and the book's right there, and I can't go and access a computer at the time, or I pull out my phone or anything because I'm in a goddamn bunny suit, and I'm not going to do that shit.
You're putting just as many conditions on you and the point at which this book is useful as you do on your masks.
So again, say I'm actually in a situation, and well, this wasn't like it wasn't like it was the only time that this is actually the case. No computer immediately available. Can't actually get to a computer because I'm dressed up. I'm not gonna fucking get another set of PPE because bunny suits are like a pain in the ass to put on and take off.
Yeah,
so,
anybody who has never worked in like anti-contamination environments, they are. You see people like you'll see like Monk's got a good scene where he gets into one and he goes into a clean room. That is not fun. It is. Not only do you have to wear at least one layer of PPE, sometimes it's two, depending on the level of the clean room.
Like, if I was in a virology lab, I would hate my life getting in here in the morning. Because you're wearing a full Class B and your bunny suit and the shit underneath that.
Yeah. I mean, even if you're going into a biopharma lab, right? Even if you're going into a biopharma lab, you still need 2 levels of PPE.
And so here's the other thing: like, if you go into the production environment, they do the pressurized air bit. Because if you get the wrong fleck of dust or whatever in there, it can change the crystallization of the medicine and make it completely useless.
Yep.
And it can affect the entire fucking room, and they'd have to reset everything and scrub down.
Now that being said, right, it is stunning how clean those floors are.
Yeah.
Like, you can lick them, and you will taste nothing.
Not only that, but you'd also be making the floor dirty.
Yeah, I mean, they have to be.
That's also true. You would actually be making it worse than it already is.
Some irony in that.
But yeah, so there's the reasons why you'd have the other reasons why you'd have a physical book aside from it being more useful to you, just in general, is that there are situations like for these higher level books of just a bunch of info. There's a reason to have them just physically there because they are literally more useful in some circumstances than the electronic version.
Yeah.
They also don't use power.
I would make this argument. I mean, one, I'd just make this argument until I got the fucking book because I'd want it the book. But I'd also be right.
Well, that's the fundamental difference between being an engineer and being a pleb, right?
Right.
The engineers are always right. If we're wrong, see rule number 1. I imagine that, like, talking to engineers for, like, most normal people is like a scene in The Exorcist, right? Like, you walk in and you just turn around and you're like, oh, I think you're wrong. And then the engineer, like, they'll be sitting there and looking at their computer and the head will just rotate around and then they'll start speaking at you in tongues and they'll just be puke everywhere and you don't know if you're puking or they're puking, but it's all just terrible because you have just realized in one terrible moment that you are speaking to a creature from another world that should not be here.
And you're wrong.
And you're wrong.
So, yeah, doubly bad. Okay, so, that's not a half-bad segue, and we're already talking about it. So I've got 2 articles linked in Show Ideas. We'll go to the first, either one. They basically go over the same thing. The Hill article is basically saying what we've been saying for some while, but psychiatric symptoms reported worldwide in some COVID-19 patients.
So a lot of the psychiatric symptoms that I without having read the article at all, by the way, that I know of, a lot of it boils down to like brain fog is a big one, and some altered mood. Some people have altered mood. Some people are just have major brain fog.
I will make this argument.
Yeah.
When we start talking about things psychological tests are notoriously bad at actually like determining different states. A lot of times after any significant life event, you will have different levels of shock or stress or something like that. And in the articles that I've seen linked associated with psychological differences in people pre and post COVID, I'm not seeing enough numbers to determine how reliable those studies are.
Well, I can tell you, for instance, my girlfriend who went through the COVID infection, that happened towards late October.
Be very careful where you step here because I'm sure she listens. I'm just throwing that out there.
She's not listening. It's fine. I'm sure she'll listen to it later on, and I'll be like, ha, see, I was right.
There's the engineer coming through.
My beautiful, amazing girlfriend.
That's exactly.
I love very dearly and very much.
You gotta. Anytime you
a bigger
for the
trouble.
girlfriend. See, this is why it's good for me to yell at the dog. I don't have to sit there and pre-curse it with, "Oh, you beautiful pup." No, you get away from my cheese.
Just say, bitch, no. So,
what engineers really think.
Right, you have to feed your girlfriend, otherwise she'll bite you.
That's exactly right. And it's not going to feel good, I assure you.
So she had COVID, and it was a scary thing, because had I been able to, I would have fucking flown down there and took her to the hospital myself. Thankfully, shit broke before I insisted, because I was saying, like, you ought to be able to make this decision for yourself, not have me, like, tell you and have someone else have to take you. But it was probably going to get to that point had things not finally taken a turn for the better. She was out, like, a month post-recovery, still feeling lethargy and so on, and being tired and such. It was obviously far less than during the early recovery phase. But, like, the whole shock, like, the idea that there's enough there to, like, give you straight up PTSD. Yeah. She couldn't, like, get up and take the 3-foot journey to go take a piss without getting lightheaded and almost blacking out.
I mean, again, though,
so
right?
I can easily see how it would just be a purely psychological instead of a physiological phenomenon.
Right, and anything, like, so my experience with the people who I know have had COVID is very different. Most of them are like, yeah, it's basically, like, they've had worse colds.
Well, I also know a bunch of people who are like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, there, like any disease, there's always a huge difference between person to person.
Yeah, absolutely.
But ultimately, the point that I'm making is that every single time I see these places, the studies come out and say, and this is what we talked about just a little bit earlier in this episode, when we start talking about the people coming out and saying long-term effects, we don't know what those effects are going to be for years, and we aren't going to know how accurate it is.
We still don't even know what all the effects are.
Right. And more to the point,
that in 10 years you grow a second arm, or sorry, third arm.
The problem that you're going to have right now is that COVID is a flashlight problem, right? We see what we shine a light on. So right now everybody's trying to collect data to determine what effect it has, and we won't know whether these rates are actually disproportionate in comparison to the general rates that exist in the population that we weren't aware of until we looked at them. Until after we're done. And that's the caution that I had, is, yes, there could be all these different effects, but these effects could have been kind of lurking in the population and they get triggered by COVID, or these effects could have been lurking in the population and it was like nobody ever bothered to interview these people, and all of a sudden now they're
I know this will annoy you a little bit. We can completely avoid the topic by not talking about it. But I'm going to do it just to begin with, and then you can just kind of be annoyed. So in a similar way, we talked about the difference between general population effects and test population effects, or in this case, study population effects, or events. When we were talking about the vaccines, and we went through the Pfizer advisory board briefing. So
that wasn't annoying. I was just trying not to fall asleep.
Right.
That was a deep reading of War and Peace right there, my friend.
Sure. I know. Believe me. It took me a couple hours to get through it myself because I kept having other shit to do all of a sudden.
Did you nod off at least once or twice?
Are we
going to count that?
I kept having other things to do.
Are we going to count those as COVID distractions or COVID-related naps?
All right. I may not have tested positive. I may not have tested positive, but I assure you that I was affected.
I'm sure you were. Now, we should probably do a full psych workup, because I bet you that report gave you more PTSD than COVID would.
Right. I don't know.
Because in the 30 minutes that you were reading from it, I got more PTSD than I would probably get.
I don't know. I mean, Lorena was pretty much like ready to fucking eat her maker there for a little bit. So, all right. So anyway, the point being that in that case, for that episode, if you can manage to listen to me reading you a boring paper, we did cover the idea of these differences between populations and whether or not they're statistically significant, et cetera, et cetera. So the same thing comes true for people who have infections and who are post-infection or post-recovery. The difference being that the timelines are significantly different when we're talking about the kind of effects we're looking for, if they're going to even happen. It's also plausible that this could just be a real kick in the nuts for a couple months, and then you're perfectly fine for the rest of your life.
Yes. Well, and there's
So
more
that's
to it
the
than
optimist
that, right?
attitude, which everybody should have.
The other thing to make is, and this is true for pharmaceutical stuff,
Yeah.
whenever you sit there and you watch the ad and it gives you this huge list of potential side effects of taking the drug, right?
Yeah.
The way we do this shit is we take every single possible thing that could possibly be wrong with you and we put it on a chart and you check yes or no, right? And that is what ends up happening. And anything that shows a slightly better than average chance gets listed as a potential side effect. It doesn't.
Well,
you
know
could
the one I
just be
like, though?
feeling shitty for a couple days because you ate a whole bunch of donuts.
Okay,
and it'll end up there.
There's one that I like though. And it really shows you the attitude of men. Viagra. Viagra. The fourth item on the list of things that can go wrong is sudden death.
Well,
but for some men, that's a trade-off for a boner.
Listen, as a male, if my choice was a slight chance of death, but I got to do it doing the thing that I love most, I would take that risk.
But imagine if it was like right before you got to the fun time. It's like, oh,
you know
God,
what? You know what? The nihilist in me would be happy knowing that I traumatized somebody for life.
I probably scared her to death with me. I'm gonna meet her in heaven with a boner.
Hold on, honey. I might have a heart attack, but I'll be over it in 5 minutes, as will you. We can finish this up in 30.
You just show up at the fucking pearly gates. What's up, honey? Let's do it in front of St. Peter.
St. Pete, buddy, we have some unfinished business.
Hey, hold this
Give
camera.
me like an hour and a half.
Hold this camera, I'll be 5 minutes.
Of course, if you end up down in hell, you just be like, Satan, buddy, bro, it's some unfinished business. Grab me like those 3 succubi over there, that 5 incubi over there. We're just gonna make it a party, and we'll be done. And then
the problem is you'd never have an orgasm because it's damnation without.
So
you know
I guess what you're going to want to do is end up in purgatory there. Give you something to do for the 1,000 years.
What's that?
I say it'd probably be better to end up in purgatory than give you something to do for 1,000 years.
You know, I actually, every single time like somebody sat there and talked about heaven, my mother was always like, hey, you go to heaven and all of your desires are granted. I'm like, that'd be fucking boring. Like, what the fuck am I going to do?
It's not just that, but like, what if your desire is to murder your boss over and over again? I mean, your boss is not going to be happy with that.
Well, don't worry, you'll have a man.
And if you don't actually do the murdering,
just like everybody else.
Well, here's the thing: if you don't actually do the murdering, then you aren't really fulfilling your desire, are you? You're just doing it kind of half-assed.
You know, the classic engineering joke, right, is an engineer dies, right? And he gets to the pearly gates, and St. Peter goes, hey, you're not on the books. You're in the wrong spot. Off you go. Down to hell you go, right? And the engineer gets down to hell, and they're kind of torturing him. And the engineer asks one of the demons, and he says, it's kind of hot down here. Why is that? Why is it so uncomfortably warm? And they're like, well, it's hell. This is the way it's supposed to go. The engineer says, well, it doesn't have to be that way. We can fix that. So the engineer installs a full-blown HVAC system, right? And then, you know, he notices that all the demons are working, 24, 36-hour work days, beating the ever-loving crap out of souls. And the engineer says, we can automate a lot of those processes for you. Here, let me help with that, right? So eventually some years go on. And, the engineer's got himself a cozy little office job and, a secretary and assistant and all that. And God looks down and he finds out that hell's turned into a rather nice place. and he goes up and he says, wait, what happened? And he finds out, he goes to St. Peter and St. Peter says, we had an engineer and he was on the books and, we couldn't find him. So he obviously was supposed to, be down there. And God goes, well, God, that was clearly a mistake. Let's go get our engineer back. So God goes down and he talks to Satan. He says, hey, Satan, I want that guy back. We made a mistake. And Satan turns to him and goes, well, yeah. And who's got all the lawyers?
That's good. That's good. I would even say it's a heavenly joke.
Yeah, it's a heavenly joke. Well, yeah, like I would be bored if everything was fixed. I mean, I'd have nothing to do. What am I supposed to do? Like go fishing? That's fucking terrible.
No, speaking of terrible, now we can go back and look at the article and look at the fucking image just right there with all the holes in the brain.
Yeah, but I mean, you know,
that's like
pictures...
you were saying, you're not going to know
for
like a decade if this is actually because of the disease.
Right, and that's because of the thing. That's the thing is we see a
could just
picture
be
like this.
Was a chronic alcoholic.
Or there was
or they ate uncooked ham or something,
Right, and in the second article that Evan put up, it talks about some psych patients, but it's only got a handful of case studies, right? Again, every time I see an article and there's no numbers, I don't believe what it has to say, because if you don't have numbers.
It has a number. It says 19 patients, and then it says COVID-19. I mean, 19 and 19, it's got to be true, right?
Well, numerologically significant.
The numbers, they match, all right?
That's exactly right. But yeah, so anytime I see these things and I'm not seeing actual numbers come out of it, if you want to talk about the quickest way that you can sort through whether the media is lying to you or not, it's whether they use numbers in the article. So any climate change article uses no numbers, therefore all climate change articles are bullshit. Until they start putting numbers in it.
Another way to look at it is if you see an article making concrete statements about the distribution of effects of this disease right now that have anything remotely considered for long term, the best they can do is, well, for one, the best they can do is go talk to someone who knows what the fuck they're talking about. But that'd be like a real doctor. Supposing that they did though, or supposing even that they did, the best a doctor is going to tell you, so you get bullshit secondhand, is that there's these corollary diseases that have these specific progressions.
Right.
And that if they have a large enough constellation of these similar diseases, they might be able to give you a reasonable picture of what to expect in years to come.
Yep.
The other side of that is if you have more severe diseases in the same category, they can give you an idea of kind of the worst case scenario in the years to come. And for this, that would be MERS and SARS. And that's going to give you like the bleak picture for right now, but not the one you should definitely expect. It's kind of like how shitty you're going to get. So this article is probably not going to go into those for comparison. It's probably just going to say these 19 patients go for them. Honestly. Yeah. So until you get enough data over years, you're not going to be able to give numbers in these articles, and you're not especially if they don't consult a professional about these corollaries.
Which,
it's
to be fair,
speculation and case
right?
studies.
And that's exactly my point, right? I totally understand that they can't give those numbers.
Right.
But if they can't give those numbers, they shouldn't be writing the article.
Well, that's what I was just saying, though. They're going to be talking about these 19 patients, and this is a case study. Now, I see this comes from The Hill, so I know it's full of shit to begin with.
I used to like The Hill, and then they
switched, right?
Crazy. Yeah, then they switched.
It's kind of like Fox News recently. They decided that only Tucker is going to have reasonable things to say on that channel.
I mean, that's not much different than Fox News for the first 2 years of the Trump presidency.
Hannity having his nose up a president's ass is pretty much typical from the Bush years. So I'm not really surprised when he says nonsense, but he's basically O'Reilly light.
I like Tucker. I think Tucker's got a good head on his shoulders, but
he needs to be on another channel.
At this point, Fox is in a bad place, so he needs to find somewhere that's not going to drag
He's holding up their viewership right now, and the moment he fucking leaves, Fox is gone.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
hiring.
He's getting paid handsomely for it, but he stands nothing to lose. Like the second that his contract's up and he goes up for bid.
Say OANN or the other ones, or was it Newsmax?
Yeah,
there's a handful of up-and-comers.
Yeah, Newsmax is going to go the way of Fox in due time.
But I don't understand why Fox decided to go after their own base.
Ratings. Here's the reason why.
Well, not just ratings. You have to consider that Fox has some ties to the intelligence agencies, and
sure,
they eventually do what they were going to do in the first place. It's just
keep in mind also that the average television viewership, and I know this is a specific metric, but bear with me here because the online viewership is not a whole lot different. The average age over the past, 10 years, each year, has been north of 70. So, the new viewership they're seeking out, that golden audience from 18 to 60 is not present. Except for certain people. Sean Hannity happened to have a slightly lower age. Tucker's got a much lower age, but that's purely because his distribution is widely bimodal. It's a bunch of young people and a bunch of really old people. And everybody who's who's kind of just south of retirement age right now doesn't like him. For some reason.
Well, I mean, he kind of turned on Trump, and, I suspect that's... I don't understand.
Well, he has principles, which is his problem.
Well, I mean, though, but we were talking about it, months ago.
Sure.
There does look like there's a lot of good evidence of fraud. The downside is that they put, Lynn Wood and what's that other one's name?
Powell. Sidney Powell.
And those people decided to go down the crazy train.
Well, look, all right.
He wasn't willing to follow them off the cliff.
I have it on good authority that the Kraken will come out of Lynn Powell's ass. Sorry, Lynn Wood. It's the same person. Lynn Wood's ass at some point to go give Sidney Powell a hug and say, "I missed you. Sorry."
Oh God.
That Kraken thing was so fucking funny. It's so stupid and cringe.
Even if they could draw those parallels, which fine, whatever. You don't bust out the serial killer string wall on the first date. That's just not where you go. You lead into that.
Yeah,
it's
not something you can just drop on people.
You just can't turn around.
Even if it's 100% legit,
Hugo Chavez
it's just too much.
Influencing our elections, because all I saw, whenever she said Hugo Chavez, it was Parks and Recreation and that one episode where they had the Venezuelans visiting that city. And it's just some guy going, Hugo Chavez. I just can't get beyond that.
It's beyond funny at this point. If they had a point, they fucking lost it. It's so they've so estranged anybody who would back them up too. That's also sane.
Well, that's not really accurate. There's actually quite a lot of backing for them, but they've lost a lot of...
and also sane.
Well, not at all. There's plenty of sane people that can follow the points on this and get to a reasonable...
They could have turned around.
Am I talking to one?
No, I think I can salvage it. I think I can salvage it, Craig. Don't worry.
Okay.
I think that at the end of the day, there was a lot of really good points with the Dominion stuff that they could have made.
Well, they could have. They still need to make the fucking points because we gotta fix this shit.
Well, they have to be allowed to make the points. That's the thing.
Even if we don't fix it now, we've got to fix this shit before the next election.
Well, I mean,
you don't pop with the vote.
The problem that you have is that this could be entirely done domestically, right? Trump had a notorious war with our intelligence agencies.
Yeah.
To sit there and suppose that they don't have the ability to break into our voting system.
Look,
ridiculous.
They had a fucking shootout. The FBI had not the FBI. The military had a fucking shootout with the CIA over in Frankfurt to get the goddamn servers they got. If you want to say
if you're to believe some of the stories anyway.
Oh no, this is. We'll just say this is unpublished, confirmed, definitely.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
So that's a thing. It's not a good thing. It's a thing. We should not be having this problem. But basically, the place where it was located was what's the word for it? It's not like so. One of the things they would do is they would ship in CIA agents as embassy staff who would do diplomatic missions in the area, and so you no longer have an import restriction on federal agents if you do that.
All right.
So if you send in CIA, technically undercover, but they know they're CIA. You send in CIA as embassy staff to do diplomatic missions, and then they work from a local facility. That local facility happened to be where they were doing things, and that was a German company. So they were working on diplomatic mission with a German company, and that was a CIA location for them to do surveillance work and the like.
Yeah, that came out in the WikiLeaks, I believe.
So no matter how you look at it from that perspective, because they were looking at Seidel over in Spain when this was going on, no matter how you look at it from that point, it's still dirty that the CIA was spying in any respect on any part of this. And more importantly,
but that's what the
tried to
CIA
fucking
does.
defend, more importantly, that they tried to fucking defend the facility in a firefight against military from the U.S. Like 6 people died getting this thing.
You know, I know that I know
soldiers dead
that
from this.
we've talked about this separately, and I know that you say that it's confirmed, but we have conflicting reports on this. Right?
Well, yeah,
there are people who are saying that didn't happen.
There's 6 military caskets that will beg to differ right now.
Do you have a link or
I can't.
any evidence for that?
No.
I could probably find you some
You'll have,
links
this
for
is
it.
one where I don't want to say it, like, you should take my word on this, but that's the level of belief I'd have to ask you for it now. That you should only take my word on it, and that means that there is not physical evidence I can point you to. So,
given your stance on masks, obviously I can't do that.
So from what I'm saying is that's the size of the grain of salt you should take with this. Boulder size, all right? So,
okay.
So until something else comes out where I can point you to a link or whatever and say this is it, you should basically treat it, as far as I'm concerned, as speculation. So I have confirmed, as far as I'm concerned, through channels I have, that this is true, but I can't go into that, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, and obviously we all have those things. As you move up in the information knowledge space, you get access to people and information that you cannot share.
Right. So the 6 bodies thing, to me, so again, this is the problem is I hate this when CNN does it, but I have to say my anonymous sources here.
Sources close to the matter.
Right, confirmed for me that there's 6 cold corpses that were involved
Sources
in getting
with knowledge of the events in question.
Exactly. Have confirmed to me that there are 6 corpses that were paid for to get those servers, which is a shame, in that they don't have a complete copy of whatever the fuck was going on.
I mean,
which is also annoying.
The only issue that I think I take with it in terms of legitimacy is that nothing has shown up about it. Right. You think, and we can assume, given Trump and his ego, right, that he would have dropped whatever he had by this point.
So the only
I wonder about that, though. If it's a part of a legal thing, then you actually couldn't. It'd have to be.
Well, here's the thing: he can because he's the commander in chief of the military.
Yeah.
So he literally can, in this case, order that the information be presented.
Oh yeah, it'd have to be declassified.
The only 40 chess move here, and I am not giving him that much fucking credit on this.
Yeah, I don't give him any of the 40 chess credit.
But if he was going to be that kind of smart person, he could present the evidence like right before the 6th, and then have the Senate and House object to the results, and then present that in the chamber, and then have the American people watch as the House disregards it and the Senate disregards it. But
I mean,
my guess is that's not going to happen.
Yeah, a lot of the things that what I hope that would be real things, they just fall into that. Boy, that'd be nice.
There's other things that are involved. For instance, not letting fucking CIA agents do that again. That could be important.
I mean, and again,
for other stuff.
I totally agree, right? Like, I've looked at some of the presentations, the mathematical stuff, all of that, and I stand with the fact that I think that there was significant amounts of fraud in the election. But at the same time, I also think that if Trump had something, he would have played that card by now.
I think he would have played it right away on the 4th.
Yeah,
let alone now.
Because there is absolutely zero reason to hold that to the chest. I know that there's the MAGA
it's to
folks.
his advantage.
Right. I know there's the MAGA folks that are like, oh, yeah, Trump is playing 40 chess. Why the fuck wouldn't you just sit there and drop your shit on day one?
Exactly. So, like, if in my estimation, if he knew something was going on and he had the info to do something about it, it would have happened immediately after the election.
Yep.
All the shit would have been shut down. He wouldn't have had this charade. He would have been able to boast about it like he does, all the way up until he gets inaugurated again.
And he would have,
and the 40 days
he would have had the
thing
White
has passed.
House.gov site posting, like instead of him sitting there and doing something to Twitter, whitehouse.gov would have posted official documents.
And here's another thing:
right?
the 40 days per the emergency order from 2018 or whatever, the 40 days to get that report have passed.
Oh yeah,
they're
still slow walking that, I believe.
So,
if
that report is coming out, it either is well past its due date and should just be dropped out incomplete so that everybody can see the damn thing if it's relevant.
Well, I mean, to Evan's point, right?
Or
like,
it's not going to come out until after the election, until after it's irrelevant.
There is a significant amount. There was some reporting on it that it is being slow walked, specifically to prevent the Trump win, right? And there is some truth to that. But at the same time, again, if Trump knew something, I have no doubt that he would have dropped it by now. Because to argue, it's this 4D chess thing, it doesn't really make sense. And that goes back to the whole like Senate, the whole phone call thing that was released today, where you sit there and you hear him and he's sitting there and we were talking about this I think before the show began.
Right.
He was sitting there and some people are saying, he's leading you to say, hey, this was illegal or that was illegal. Now, if Trump knew, Trump does not have the ability to keep his mouth shut.
Right.
He really doesn't.
He's missing that filter, and it's fucking embarrassing.
It is. And like, if we want to talk about Trump, right? Trump has two major flaws. One, he doesn't. Well, actually, and they're the same thing, right? He doesn't have a filter, and this screws him politically because he says shit that the news media can take out of context. Right, and you read the transcripts, and if you're a little bit more informed, you can say, yeah, that's not what he actually said.
Well, what'll happen is he'll say something. He'll have said something where he's supposed to say, "I didn't murder that woman," but what he'll actually say is, "I murdered that woman, but not really."
Yeah.
And then they're gonna say, "Okay, we're clipping that. That's obvious, and that's great."
Right. Exactly.
Which explains every fucking controversy that he's had for the most part.
Exactly. I mean, and you can even see that in like when Giuliani.
Well, the fine people on both sides thing was a great example of this shit.
Absolutely. He has a paragraph in between the two things. It's not two separate speeches. He said it in the same thing, and he puts in all of this other shit in between his direct statement. So he doesn't have a filter, and he can't control himself politically. But at the same time, speaking from the perspective of someone who knows how certain information is handled, the fact that he doesn't have a filter is a liability.
Big time.
Right? And to think that there are groups or organizations that would sit there and, regardless of how effective he was, rein in his capabilities simply because he's a liability from an information perspective. I mean, he really is a liability from an information perspective.
The only caveat I'd put on that is that the fucking Pentagon lied to him for what, like months, a year?
Yeah.
About the deployment distribution?
Yeah. And people try to say that there aren't people that have been working against his interests directly. I mean, and this comes out, Yeah.
Yep.
So
I mean, I fully believe that he is facing the, my wife is sitting there and saying, I think there's a shadow government and all this other stuff. My wife's, like I said earlier, my wife's supposed to be the voice of reason, but at the same time, there seems to be, right? Like we had these elected representatives, we have all of that stuff, and yet we have all of these people who are kind of, not necessarily permanent bureaucrats, but permanent people who inform the bureaucrats. And guess what?
Yeah.
information controls the future, and we need to look at it that way, in that perspective. And when we do that, Trump is at best a liability. Even if he was economically right on par, and even if he was cleaning up our government, right, he is still a liability because his mouth opens and flaps with zero controls.
Yeah,
and he has not been able to rein that in the 4 years he's been president.
He is pure loose lip sink ships, is what he is.
He really.
I don't know. I'll take it.
I'm
happy to see it.
Yeah, let me
I would love to see him. What I really love to see him do is, and better yet, with all the information that would be used against him too. I'd love to see him come out and just info dump on Inauguration Day. Just there it all is. I'm out of here. See you guys.
Yeah. If it all falls apart, I think that is really his trump card.
The best nuclear option that he could do is just
declassify
here's all the shit on him
and just publish it all on a,
on a government website too. Long enough for people to download it, because then it'll be unpublished.
Again, he's had the opportunity. He hasn't taken it. I think it's done. Right? Like we are dealing with somebody who has zero ability to control themselves, who has no ability to concede that they lost. And even if we turn around and we take some of the best presentations that we have, and that'll be like Dr. Shiva and some of the rest that we saw, that are some of the best presentations of election fraud evidence that we have to date in terms of analysis, right? It doesn't matter, because Trump has not been able to put any of that stuff in the forefront.
Well, it's not even that he hasn't been able to. He hasn't genuinely been allowed. Every court case has been either put out for...
That's the thing. Even if you want to go ahead and count all the rest of the court cases, which a lot of them have been between Lynn Woods and Sidney Powell. So if you think they're loony already, then you should consider that most of those odd cases they cite were filed by those two fuckers. So, like, only a handful, like, 3 or 4 of them? I think 4 now, right? Have actually been filed by Rudy Giuliani on Trump's behalf.
Maybe 5, yeah. There's not
so
we'll
say 5.
By his direct legal team.
Yeah, we'll say 5. All the other ones have basically been thrown out on standing grounds. And in fact, several of the ones that Trump got rejected from personally, through Giuliani, were rejected on the grounds of standing as well. Like, I mean, there's the one that was outright rejected by the Supreme Court, where Trump tried to petition through Giuliani. That's one of the we'll say 4 that have been rejected. Another, and then there was one other that was rejected on standing, and I think another one was rejected on procedural grounds.
None of the cases have really been evaluated.
They haven't showed evidence yet. They
have
never
shown evidence, but they haven't done the investigations which would unveil the proof.
Well, here's the other thing: they're doing this stuff in civil court. If it's a criminal matter, it has to be handled by the government. It can't be handled by private citizens, because they're civil matters if they're filed by private citizens. Now, you could easily say that spurs the requirement for a federal investigation. Sure. There's probably already one underway if there is anything that's going to come out of that. But they're also, via DOJ policy, not going to try to impact the election in any way to appear nonpartisan, because that's what they're supposed to do.
Yep.
So if you're waiting on something to happen, it's probably not even going to be released until after Biden's out.
Which, by the way, will create a constitutional crisis. And if we actually get an investigation and it turns out there was sufficient fraud and Trump should have won, that's going to create a huge crisis come, let's say they release it in June.
Sure.
Like, what are you supposed to do with that?
Well, immediately what happens is you impeach him and blah, blah, blah. But, that's probably going to be one of the ways that
you can't necessarily impeach him, right? Because you could only impeach him in the event that he actually did something wrong. You can't impeach him based on...
Sure.
Yeah, but you'd have to prove that he was responsible. And let's be honest,
well,
right?
Come on. Hold on a second. Let's go back and look at the first impeachment here.
Biden is not with it enough to sit there and have orchestrated any of this shit.
Look. Here. We need to make a very clear distinction between impeachment and actually kicking out the president.
True.
The impeachment is the accusation. and he would absolutely be impeached. But in the same way that Trump was basically rubber stamped to stay in office, you can bet your ass that if they get the Senate, Biden's just going to get the same exact rebound.
Well, I mean, the difference is that they never actually introduced any real evidence that Trump did anything.
Sure. And that's
right.
what we were just speculating on here, was that suppose there was none according to Biden, then he would get the same exact treatment that Trump got. He would get impeached.
Right.
It would be a circus. It would be
but
over.
At the same time, we've never dealt with a situation wherein somebody is supposed to be president, but they're not, because we didn't have enough time to investigate.
Sure.
And
I was saying, they might not even release that until after Biden's out of office.
And that's another possibility.
If Biden gets in, you can pretty well rest assured that any kind of investigation in that, if they're not able to shut it down entirely, will be completely buried.
Well, here's the other side of this. If, suppose, he isn't capable of doing that for whatever reason, if there's a shred of integrity, and I'm not saying there is, what he might also do is just resign and then tell the American people why. That, again, assumes he has the integrity to do something like that, and it probably wouldn't happen unless everybody already knew about it. But that's also, when he's talking about, there's what would happen with a constitutional crisis, yada yada. I mean, this is the point where you can kind of draw a parallel with Nixon. I mean, it's a shitty parallel, but sure there is one. Everybody knew that Nixon did this shit, and he's guilty, get him out, etc. He'll be impeached or whatever, and then he just resigns. That would be the logical step there. Now, you'd immediately still be stuck with Kamala, whatever, but, that's the point.
That's kind of the thing. That's one of the reasons why it's a shame that we have not gone after the merits of the case. Right?
Sure,
that is a huge mistake from the courts in that they didn't address the merits of the cases. Because it would be one thing if you could turn around to the Trump supporters and say, yeah, guess what? You actually had your day in court and you were laughed out of it.
That's probably what people are saying right now, and they know that that's not true.
Right. If they had, and I've seen that a couple times where people are like, oh, well, you failed to present your case some 50 times or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Well, no, you never heard it. You didn't hear the case 50 times.
Well, I was just discussing with my cousin about this shit, and he's like, give me this crap about speaking about rule of law, blah, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, but look, everything they're doing is pursuing legal avenues. It's the moment they step out of line and they do something illegal, and let's be clear, the phone call today, that record, if that was just what was presented in media, and outright at the beginning, we know that's not true. If it was just a little bit that they clipped out and rearranged, where it makes him sound like a mob boss grilling somebody, that's gray area legally. So when my cousin throws that shit at me and he says, we're just talking about, rule of law, blah, 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 it's all right. Yeah, this is more of a moral feeling, but that's definitely legal gray area. So,
the problem is that when my understanding, and I hate to say this because I haven't really looked at the tape, but from what I have read, when we look at the full hour-long thing, it doesn't really look as much like mob boss grilling
or anything, basically.
Right.
Yeah, it really looks like somebody. You get some folks coming in and saying, "Oh yeah, he's just acting like an investigator," where he has some evidence up his sleeve. And other people who are coming in and saying, yeah, it really looks like he doesn't know one way or the other, and he's basically stating what he wants to find. Yeah, he's fishing.
And I'll get a copy of that YouTube video that's got the whole thing, if anybody actually does want to listen to the whole thing. Well, and it's not the whole thing, apparently. It doesn't include the intro, but it's most of it.
It didn't include, a specific person or whatever.
Well, there's two, right? So there's one that doesn't include the intro. They cut it off.
Yeah, this one they edited out the name of the falsely accused elections workers or whatever.
Right. Right, which is and to be fair, that's something that I think is perfectly responsible. Right?
Yeah.
If that's the only edit that you've done it for a good reason.
Well, yeah, that's fair journalism, basically.
Right.
And, I mean, honestly, that's about all we can hope for these days is fair journalism, and we barely even get that.
Well, that's a separate issue, you know. I mean,
Oh, so there's this. I just gotta throw this one in real quick here because this is funny as fuck to me earlier. And someone just reminded me of something else that exists that's also cringe. Did you see the Arizona Republican Party tweeted out that meme of the fucking scene at the end of the Lord of the Rings where it's like, you know, for Frodo? But in this one it says for Donald, and it shows him running towards the orcs. So I said, you're just trying to lose people now. Just admit it.
you know, that was actually how I spent my Christmas.
And so someone else
I watched all of the Lord of the Rings extended versions.
Yeah. So then another friend comes in and he says, I don't know, the ones of Jesus holding Trump while he's signing an executive order are bad too.
I mean, are we back to orc posting? Because, I mean, orcs are the new Gondorians.
Because I've got memes! I don't know, maybe. That would be fascinating.
You know, orc posting is good times, you know.
I'm back to posting things like this.
But I do have some things that are...
That!
Ooh, pretty.
That is prime ad candy is what that is.
But I actually do have a couple of things here. Let me get back to... Because we were going to talk about fusion, too. And there's some really interesting stuff happening with that.
All right.
So let me get the old link, and I'll drop it in the staff chat here, and we'll go from there. But
We
it's
did
about
an episode where we talked about 3D printing, and I was just like, whatever. I don't know anything about this shit.
But now you have two people with personalities that know things about this one.
So the public-private partnership, which has kind of been pioneered by dealing with this COVID crisis, is going to be used to hopefully develop fusion energy.
Fuck it, let's do it.
But this is coming out of the DOE.
So that's the Tokamaks design.
Plasma Physics Laboratory.
No, that's actually not what they were really talking about in that article. I gotta find out.
You break it down. You're the man who knows, so I'll leave it to you.
Alright, so let's see. I think I'm trying to find the article again.
PPPL.
Yeah, Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory.
So this isn't the oh, okay, this is public-private DOE. So this isn't the one saving businesses, this is just the lab.
So before we talk about fusion, we have to talk a little bit about why fusion hasn't happened now. Which I actually linked before. So the short version is everybody always says that fusion is 50 years away, and the reason is that back in the 1960s, 1970s, the DOE was handed a paper that said, this is the amount of money we need to spend on fusion if you want to achieve it. Right, and they gave a couple different fusion funding baselines. Like, when did you want to have fusion energy as a viable energy source by, and how much money did you have to spend to get it there?
Right.
Right, and we basically chose the path of never achieving fusion. We literally came below the funding that we've put towards fusion is literally below the you will achieve fusion never funding. We actually somehow spent less than that on fusion.
Which is
I don't know how it's possible. It's pretty amazing.
We should be, in my mind right now, because fusion's so critical, we should basically be spending the same amount, we should be matching the NASA budget on fucking fusion.
We should be spending at least that.
Or more.
Considering energy is, so to give the layman some understanding of fusion, right? Your average U-235 fission produces roughly 200 MeV. You don't really need to know what an MeV is. I mean, you can go look it up. It converts to joules, and then you can convert joules to watts. But per atom of U-235 that fissions, you get 200 MeV.
Which is a whopper of energy.
It is a pretty big whopper of energy. Now, per 4 AMU of hydrogen, essentially, which is, by the way, the most abundant element in the universe. For 4 MeV of hydrogen, you get roughly 14 MeV. That means that you get like 20 some odd times as much energy from a fusion reaction per unit mass as you do from a fission reaction. It is absolutely astounding. And, oh yeah, by the way, not only that, if we were to do like deuterium fusion or tritium and hydrogen fusion or any one of these other types, we actually get helium as a byproduct, which we could sell, which means it is not just the absolute massive amount of energy that we get from the most available abundant elements in the universe that we get, but then we can sell the byproducts of fusion for profit.
We're also kind of running out of helium, if we're to believe everybody.
We are.
So here's the other side of that. If we just go to the moon and mine the shit, the helium-3 that we need, because that's the basis for that, if you just fuse helium-3 with protium, like that reaction gives you electric current.
Yes, it does.
So instead of neutrons, which cause damage to your devices, you just get electricity and heat.
Yes.
It is the win-win of the reactions. The problem is that it's so fucking rare on Earth, but it's built up in millions of tons, let's say, that are accessible on the moon, and that's enough to outlast everybody's lifetime today. Period.
We can do if we coupled fusion reactors with fission reactors, we could actually produce the actual hydrogen or the deuterium and the tritium that we need, which are just isotopes of hydrogen for those who don't know, right? And
you can make heavy water out of water, and then you can take the heavy water and fuse it.
Exactly. So we could actually produce in our reactors a fusion-fission cycle in which we would have basically infinite energy.
Here's where I get to berate you, oh master of neutrons and shit. The same way you beat me over the head with solar, why the fuck would we need nuclear, the fission plants, if we could just go and distill it out of the water? Because there's enough of it in a glass of water, enough deuterium, to do some serious work.
Yes and no, right? So ultimately, we had this discussion earlier on, and you asked me a really good question, and I had the worst and shittiest answer because I was completely unprepared for it. But I'm prepared now.
Yes, all right.
I've done my master's course.
I want to hear how smart I was before.
Right. So the problem that you have is that fission, as a reaction, what we typically do for our fission reactions is U-235. And so we can classify our nuclides into fertile, fissile, and basically non-whatever.
And agile.
Sure, whatever
and
you want.
Hostile.
Nobody gives a fuck fuels, right? So our fissile fuels are things that are they will fission very quickly and easily and efficiently. And to give you an idea of how easy it is, the very first nuclear reactor on planet Earth was about 1 billion years ago. I think it's 1 billion years ago, and it's in Africa.
It's a natural reactor,
And it was a natural reactor. So basically what ended up happening is if you take enough U-235, or just enough, in this case it would have just been enough uranium. Back in the day, before a lot of the U-235 had decayed away, they would have had enough U-235 to start and initiate a chain reaction. So when this basin in Africa filled up with water, it would have had enough water to act as a moderator. And the question that Grandmaster Craig of, whatever, posed to me prior when I was unprepared was, why is it that we can't run fast reactors? And so what ends up happening in a thermal reactor spectrum, these things are running around about 0.025 MeV. Right? So really, or 0.025 EV. So they're really, really, really low energy reactions. They're actually, the neutrons that are happening when we start running most of our reactors are happening with about the kinetic energy as about the speed on a neutron of what you see in your average kinetic energy of molecules.
About a gnat spark.
Whatever.
Compared to a locomotive.
Yes. So it's not particularly fast. This means that the neutrons can be easily captured, and it's what allows those fission reactions to happen relatively easily. And that's one of the reasons why fission was achieved very early on. as we go up in scale, where we actually really have a lot of fuels is our fertile fuels. And our fertile fuels are things like U-238, which can be converted to plutonium-239, which is then fissile. Or thorium-232, which can be converted to uranium-233. All it does is absorb a neutron, it converts that neutron to a proton, moves up in the scale, and then all of a sudden it can explode, right?
Right.
All of these things are great things, great ways to produce fuel out of things that are not fuel and otherwise useless isotopes.
So, by the way, this is what people are talking about when they're talking about breeder reactors.
Yes, they are.
They're talking about running these fast neutrons into things like thorium to make these fissile fuels.
Now, ultimately, thermal neutrons, because they're so slow at 0.025 MeV, that's really easy to capture. So we got to think of a nucleus and a neutron as interacting with kind of a planet with some gravity, right? So your collision with that planet is bad, obviously.
Well,
we don't want large asteroids to collide with planet Earth, but certainly not something that's 1/235th the mass of the planet. But at the same time, what ends up happening is it interacts not just with the surface of the planet Earth, but with its gravitational field. And this is the same thing in a nuclear reaction, where a neutron comes in, and in order to be captured, it has to be captured by the nuclear field. So we have, as we operate in the thermal spectrum, that's kind of the lowest energy a neutron can have, because it's basically the exact same kinetic speed as the molecules that surround it. So if I have a reactor operating at, say, room temperature, it's going to be operating at the same speed as water molecules are, which, Craig probably knows exactly what that is off the top of his head.
Shit.
But I don't give a shit. So it happens.
So here's another allegory that doesn't involve you having to think about a fucking planet with gravity.
That was the best allegory ever.
It's a great one. It's actually perfect. But let me go ahead and add on to this one. Another step down the ladder here. Imagine having a ball of clay in your hand, and you want to throw it so it sticks on a window, but you don't want to throw it through it, and you don't want it to bounce off. That's actually a decent allegory. But I like planets, because planets are amazing. Are cool, yeah.
Planets are cool.
So that's what ends up happening. If the neutrons are in the thermal spectrum, they're traveling relatively slow, and because they're traveling relatively slow, they can be captured relatively easily, and once they can get captured, they can get absorbed by the nucleus. All of that is why we tend to run our reactors, and once they're absorbed, then that's what produces fission. So 235 goes to 236, U-235 goes to U-236, which is incredibly unstable and explodes. Right? So that's how a fission reactor operates. When we start talking about our breeder reactors are basically a neutron comes in, and at thermal speeds, it'll still get captured by that 238 nucleus, but at the same time, we're not producing enough neutrons that are being captured by that U-238 to sustain the reaction. Whereas if we run it at a faster spectrum, which typically involves a non-hydrogenous media, if we use something like water, it's got hydrogen, and if a cue ball hits another cue ball, right, half of its energy goes away instantly. Whereas if a cue ball hits a building, it's going to skip off, right? Yeah. Like that we all kind of know.
You'll boil off pretty quickly, basically.
Right, exactly. So you can retain the energy in the cue ball if it's just bouncing off really heavy nuclei. You won't retain the energy in the cue ball if it's bouncing off lighter nuclei or collides with the hydrogen. So hydrogenous media is what we use in thermal reactors to slow down our neutrons, right? And that allows them for ready absorption. If we want it to be in the fast spectrum, and the reason we want to slow things down, we don't want to slow things down. So what typically happens in fast reactors or breeder reactors is they will have a wall around the reactor of fertile materials. This will be U-238. It'll be thorium-232, something like that. It'll be an outer wall where the spare neutrons that aren't being consumed as part of the fission reaction are being consumed in these things to turn them from fertile fuels into fissile fuels, which we can then burn once we basically take these fuel components out and move it into the interior of the reactor. And so the reason that it becomes much harder when we move to the fast spectrum is because the neutrons go from being at 0.025 eV to the average neutron being emitted from a fission reaction of 200 MeV being emitted at roughly 2 MeV. So it goes from 0.025 MeV to 2 MeV, which is roughly about 40 million. I think is roughly what math works out to be. 80 million.
It's big.
It's big.
Big difference.
Right.
Really big difference.
So
You do this
instead of
on
your
log
asteroid that gets captured by the Earth's gravitational field, the asteroid just says "fuck you" and misses it.
Yeah.
So that's what ends up becoming the problem when we start talking about fast reactors. Is they're much more difficult to build because the neutrons are just not captured as much. So you need a whole lot more shielding and a lot more other effects. You can't have a moderator in there, so you can't use things like water. You have to use more complex.
And not having a moderator is kind of a big deal because if you don't have a moderator, shit goes sour.
Right.
You know, you have big problems all of a sudden.
And when we start talking about trying to slow these things in the thermal spectrum, we use something like water, which has 2 hydrogens to an oxygen, and again, a hydrogen hit with a neutron. It loses half its energy in one collision, whereas if I go up to something like sodium, it just keeps on skipping off that because by the time you hit carbon, it's basically like hitting a wall because the mass of the target is significantly greater than the mass of the incident neutron.
So carbon being about 12, neutron being 1.
Right. And by the time you start seeing that, it's like a 20% loss depending on its incident angle and a whole bunch of other stuff. But that's one of the reasons why fast reactors become much more difficult to maintain is because ultimately you just can't capture those neutrons, and you need to capture the neutrons in order to turn it from a fertile fuel into a fissile.
And this, by the way, is why when people talk about these things, they talk about reaction cross-sections, they talk about mean-free paths.
That's all very true. I tried to leave that out of the conversation to not make it...
speech for how big the gap is between targets and how fucking small the bullseye is.
That's... All of that is actually very... Craig is introducing a lot of concepts that I was trying to leave out of the conversation.
Well, that's like... Well, you brought planets in, you dick.
Planets are amazing.
Planets might be cool, but, not everybody quite gets nuclear physics.
Off.
Everything is all related, but that's fundamentally the difference between fission reactions. That's why it's very difficult to go from a thermal reactor, which everything's essentially moving around room speed velocity, to a fast reactor where everything's moving around 80 million times faster.
So, to bring it back into the analogy with the targets and such, just to round that off, the targets in thermal reactors are much larger and are much closer together.
Substantially larger.
And they, and you got many more rings to take up momentum because you have all the water around. Mm-hmm. The fast reactors, the targets are little pinpricks, and you're trying to hit a pinprick with a grain of sand.
You're trying to hit a bullet with another bullet at warp speed.
Right, there you go.
It's a very bad situation. It makes it very complex. So
no, in fact, you're doing it billions of times.
Right.
Per centimeter means you eventually do hit something.
You do, and ultimately, when we start talking about things like U-238 reactors or sodium fast reactors, the reason they're able to actually work is that U-238 actually maintains a fairly large cross-section into the 1-2 MeV range. But by the time you start getting beyond that, so like the upper end energy spectrum for these neutrons, which by the way are converted into heat for the most part when they collide with the nucleus, right? They release some energy and we convert that into steam, which we convert into electricity.
Still spinning fans.
That all.
And then we go back to the 18th century.
Yes, because all power is steam power. Yep. We should live in a steampunk world. But that's the fundamental difficulty. As soon as we start talking about it, you just don't have a very large target. You're zipping around significantly faster. It can't be captured by the nuclear field. It is your cross section is smaller. Your mean free path is larger, and so we end up having to design our reactors in special ways and use. First off, water is a pretty amazing coolant, right? It's cheap. It's abundant and it's everywhere. In
Has a
order
high
to start
capacity.
using something that, we want our coolants to always be liquid so that we can pump them, right? And we start talking about something like...
and solids suck.
Yes, they do. So you start talking about trying to do anything outside of that, and then you have to have something that can actually become liquid at a reasonable temperature, and we have to sit there and maintain... we have to deal with the heat that's being output of this thing that's maintaining like a molten salt type thing or a molten sodium.
Oh, and here, let me blow some, if anybody who's listening is chemically inclined, let me blow your mind on this one here. Remember that, you know how electrons have energy levels? Well, all the same shit's going on inside the nucleus, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Protons have energy levels, neutrons have energy levels, all that stuff's going on in the middle, so temperature is important.
Temperature is very important. It's difficult to maintain. So what ends up happening is we have these very complex reactors that aren't very stable and they don't hold up very well as compared with a thermal reactor, which, going back to what I said originally, the very first reactor on planet Earth was like 1 billion years ago, and it happened completely and totally naturally. You put enough fissile material into a small enough space and it reacts. Right. In fact, the first nuclear reactor that we actually built was literally called the pile reactor.
Right.
They literally piled
Pile one in a fucking racquetball court.
Right. They piled a whole bunch of fissile material and said, "Hey, what happens? Oh, look, we generated heat." Right.
Yeah, it rose a couple degrees. Everybody cheered.
So fissile reactions are very, very easy.
Fast
reactions
are blew up.
The pile 2 didn't blow up.
No, which pile was it? One of them just popped. Like it didn't blow up, but like it got enough heat where it just kind of went.
I don't think they ever really popped, right? Like pile 1 and pile 2 were both kind of like the same thing. I think they were both like it was both Chicago, right?
Yeah.
So they built both of these reactors out in the Chicago lab.
So it was the racquetball court. They built one right next to the other in the same court.
Right, and they ended up I think they just produced excessive heat. Same thing with the molten salt reactors, right? The molten salt reactors never really blew up, but they just kind of yeah. So in any case, it's really easy to build a fission reaction in the thermal spectrum. It's significantly harder to build one in the fast spectrum, even though there's ample more fuels available to it.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why you start talking about things like molten salt reactors. And as much as we would love to have thorium, because thorium has a half-life of 14 billion years, and so there's literally pretty much all the thorium that's ever been existed in the universe still available to us.
To put this in perspective here, bismuth is actually technically radioactive on about the same scale, and bismuth is used fucking everywhere.
Yep.
Now, there's a couple extra zeros, but at that scale, it just doesn't matter.
You go to places like India, and you can pick up in your hand the sand from certain places, and I think India's got one of these beaches, and you'd have enough sand in your hand to power the entire planet for a significant amount of time. Like there's just that much energy that's available in this material, but to do that, you have to do these crazy salt reactions in order to have things not be overly moderated. And so that you have to maintain. First off, you have to maintain. You start using like water as a moderator. Hydrogen will capture a lot of neutrons, and so if we use water as a moderator, then all of a sudden, not only do we shift everything to the thermal spectrum, so we're not really breeding as many fuels, and we're not producing as many neutrons, because the faster that neutron impacts, a target nucleus, the more neutrons we get as a result of the fission. It's actually directly proportional to the energy of the neutrons interacting with it. So not only if we use like water as a moderator do we get fewer neutrons because some of them are being absorbed by the hydrogen, but then on top of that we also have the complication of issues associated with the energy spectrum.
Now, so to go ahead and knock off a thing that someone clever might say immediately. You can't just let it all turn into heavy water, or even to extra heavy water, tritium oxide, and then just say, okay, now the neutrons aren't going to get stuck anymore. It doesn't really work like that. You're still going to be losing a shit ton of energy to heat, because let's not forget that once it's neutron saturated, it can still jiggle around.
Yep. And I mean, Once it's neutron saturated, it'll start to decay, and so you get new neutrons, but those neutrons won't be emitted at the same energy levels as
and that
the reactor.
doesn't act as a way to get them back to thermal react. It doesn't work in a way that's going to make them useful.
Right.
Like
exactly.
That. They'll just decay into protons and other shit. And again, you have the proton back, which is bad.
So that's the challenge going between thermal reactors, which is what most of what we have is, to fast reactors. And then when we start talking about fusion is a whole different kettle of fish. Because fusion, we're trying to sit there. So think of it like the way man has approached fire is how we're kind of approaching fusion reactors, right? So
Bang sticks.
Okay.
We are literally, so your Tokamaks are rubbing a stick furiously and hoping it explodes.
That's more or less it, yeah.
That's really what happens.
That's a really good analogy for it.
It really is. So
now the sticks are really big and they're really far apart, but you're trying really hard.
They're roughly the size of a small warehouse, but we are still attempting to pressurize a stick and rub it together such that we overcome what's known as the Coulomb barrier and the nuclei fuse. It's
really, 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 really hard, by the way.
It's really hard. It's really, really hard. And especially considering, so first off, once we actually get these things to do that, right, we do this through magnetism. So we're basically forcing all of these molecules to bounce against a whole bunch of magnets, a whole bunch of hydrogen, which is difficult to contain in the first place. Whatever. Same thing. Right?
So okay. Whereas normally...
Yes, they aren't impacting the exact magnet
Whereas normally you're doing touch, and that's also bouncing off electric fields. We're talking about a field that's extended into a vacuum.
Yes. Well, it's not a vacuum.
It's close enough.
It's not a vacuum.
But what about the dark matter?
It has the fuel in it.
Listen, dark matter is a byproduct of the electromagnetic universe. Yeah.
We're not doing that. I'm not saying shit right now.
I know you aren't.
I want to.
I know you do. Which is why
everybody listening to earlier
Evan's
episodes.
baiting us. He's being evil, and he's baiting us.
Everybody go listen to Evan's earlier episodes and support his Pidgeon.
So in fusion, it's like rubbing two sticks together in the woods, right? It's very homoerotic, and nothing actually happens.
Brokeback Mountain.
It is Brokeback Mountain.
It's a much larger tent. Okay, here's another complication to think of. The sun relies on having a gigantic ass in order to get enough confinement. In order to have enough confinement to allow quantum tunneling to cause fusion. Whereas what we have to do is use extreme fucking heat and magnets.
No, we don't even use extreme fucking heat. We use the magnets to generate the huge fucking heat.
The point is that you get shit really fucking hot instead of getting it really dense.
Right, and that's one of the problems that we have.
So we can't take tunneling into account because tunneling doesn't work if you're not near anything.
Right. So what ends up happening in our Tokamaks is our Tokamaks use a huge magnetic field, and it's basically, you can think of it like super pressurizing a soda bottle. Right, we are trying to put enough pressure on the magnetic pressure on the hydrogen atoms that they fuse together, which is exactly why it's like rubbing sticks in the woods.
We should also be clear on this. It's not the atoms anymore. It is definitely a plasma, so we're trying to cram protons.
Right, we're trying to cram. Well, I mean that's the whole crossing the Coulomb barrier thing.
Well,
but we're trying to take hydrogen, we're heating it up simply by compressing it with magnets and hoping it works, right? And that's where fusion is today. That's the Tokamak reactor.
Yeah.
And it is literally like rubbing two sticks together in the.
And if you're wondering how the hell that gets initiated because hydrogen has no dipole, the way that it gets initiated is you just cause a little spark in the chamber. You have enough out of that to get a cascade and cause a plasma. The plasma causes heating and radiative heating. That will strip the electrons off the remaining fuel, and it becomes effectively a vacuum around a plasma, which is the only reason the inside of that thing
not
survives.
A vacuum.
The only reason the inside of that thing survives is
vacuum.
because all of the heat that is hitting it is now radiated, which is far less efficient than conductive.
Right. So this is why I was using the analogy of rubbing two sticks in the woods. It sounds like it should work, and it will work, assuming you put enough into it. But it's very...
Well, you do fuse things. That's the important thing. You do actually fuse things.
We do.
Very well.
We do. But
we don't. A ton of energy
we put a lot more energy into getting the fusion than we get out of the fusion that we produce.
To my recollection, I should say, we've gotten close to being over unity, which is
we are really, really close.
We're within a percentage of being over unity, but not at scale, and two, we haven't fucking got there yet.
Yeah, well, so that's what we're going into next. So the next we have is the lifter facility. That's the second type of fusion. So if anybody wants to go watch The Expanse from season 1 to the end, you will eventually see a lifter reactor used in these fusion things, where they basically they take a fuel pellet, which is some sort of super hydrogenated...
Oh, the laser one, okay.
Right.
I thought you were like, well, there's the lithium, or sorry, not lithium, there's the lifter for thorium, and then there's the other one.
It's laser-induced fusion...
There you go.
TER, whatever TER is. Something energy reaction.
Thermal excitation reaction, whatever, right?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, anyway.
So
it's
the
an
lifter,
E in this one.
the lifter is basically, so where you're talking about your Tokamaks being like rubbing two sticks in the woods, your lifter is basically taking a stick and rubbing it against another like wooden block and hoping a spark forms. Right? It's the same very energy intensive reaction that is why we aren't getting fusion.
And again, the sun has a much easier time of doing this by about a factor of 3. Because it's so fucking large, and you don't have that advantage when you're doing fusion on Earth.
Yes,
period,
it turns out it's a little bit harder to produce a 1,000 Jupiter size, or a little bit harder to produce something in a warehouse than it does in roughly 1,000 Jupiter size masses of...
Right. So you could say there's something to having a nearly limitless supply of heat and pressure.
What we are saying is that size matters. It's not simply the motion of the ocean, it is the size of the boat.
So the density of the plasma in the middle of the sun does most of the work by getting everything so close together. Yeah. And then the heat actually gives it enough energy to cross the tunneling barrier. You don't have anywhere near the same densities in the plasmas you can produce inside of a lab condition.
Right.
Now, the idea with the lifter is that you might be able to get there for a moment, and it might be a little bit simpler to do it that way than to do it in the other way with the Tokamak, where you're just relying on raw heat to have enough kinetic energy to overcome the entire Coulomb barrier at once.
Yes. So basically the idea is that if I fire a super laser at a hydrogen atom, then it might have enough energy to impel it into the other hydrogen atom, which will initiate fusion, and if we have a chemically constrained pellet, that fusion reaction will continue and initiate fusion reactions through the other hydrogen constrained elements in that fuel pellet.
It's basically a miniature bomb that will go off if you give it enough of a kick at the beginning.
And the lifter and the Tokamak have had similar levels of success. But again, both of them are basically like rubbing two sticks in the woods. Yeah, the Tokamak is literally sitting there with your hands and rubbing a stick on a plate, and the lifter is more like shoving it down the whole entire thing and trying to generate friction force.
So the Tokamak design has gotten a lot of advances. From one of the advances they have like a twist in the field to cause the swirling in the flow. Which looks really cool on a computer animation, but doesn't actually do a whole lot better.
No, it doesn't.
But it brought us a lot closer to Unity than we were.
So it does get us a little bit closer to Unity. The biggest advancement in fusion energy has actually been in material science,
Yeah.
So materials have allowed us to get our magnetic rings. So again, all of these things for, say, a Tokamak are, and this is more for the Tokamaks than it is for the lifter style designs.
Sure.
The Tokamaks have been able to be wrapped in smaller and tighter electromagnets, which allow us to scale down our fusion reactors. And there's some of that is proposed for the next level's fusion design. A lot of that is coming out of MIT. They're one of the ones that is doing one of these newer designs with some of the electromagnetic materials. And then there's a couple others that are embracing that. So again, that's one of the reasons why if you were to ask me which fusion design do I support, it would be probably closer to the Tokamaks and the lifters. But in reality, there's a third design that has been proposed, but I don't think anybody's built yet. At least
you're talking about the sodium. Yeah, the cool one, right?
Which one?
The real steampunk one with the big pistons.
No.
No?
I don't think so.
Well,
that was cool. That one produces a plasma in large injector, and it drops the plasma into a sphere of sodium that then gets compressed by steam pistons, and the thing goes off. The thing's supposed to go off like once a minute.
So he's actually
so goddamn cool.
What Craig is talking about is, I believe, a Skunkworks project with Raytheon, I think, is the company that is producing that. And they were hoping to hit...
Linus Tech Tips did a video on them for the data work they do, and that's worth it just to watch, like, the crazy shit they have to do to get data out of the experiment.
Yeah, no, it's a bit nuts. What I personally propose, and so what you'll find from engineers if you actually talk to us in a sane and reasonable voice, we use common sense 9 times out of 10, and we don't actually go to equations until somebody asks us a question and demands that we prove it to them on paper. So
then we're right, and then they're wrong, and then the world continues.
Right, exactly. So
that's where the Klingon comes in.
One of the approaches that I personally support is a Tokamak style design with a particle accelerator attached to it. So the Tokamak gets it close, but it doesn't actually. It just basically holds confinement, and then your particle accelerator fires a hydrogen atom into the mixture at speed, and or a series of hydrogen atoms. They will initiate the fusion chain reaction rather than trying to rub two sticks in the woods. Essentially, I'm proposing using the equivalent of a match instead of sitting there and hoping that my Native American fire starting technology capabilities are really good. So that
will be difficult to get over Unity because you're gonna have to fire the fucking giant ass particle accelerator. That said, particle accelerators have given us things like more advanced proton therapies in the medical field. So
which are amazing.
It's not at a reason here.
It isn't. So we would have the ability to tell exactly where the first fusion would occur and exactly how much energy. You can
design everything around that. You could even have the vast majority of your field large and have one choke point that leads off to a loop that does the heat exchange.
So those are
possibilities there.
I've heard of
particle accelerators are a pretty mature technology.
They are.
Pretty fairly, yeah.
So my understanding is that has been proposed. I thought it was a unique concept idea of Steve, but I've actually, as I've gone into nuclear engineering a little bit more, that's actually a concept that's been proposed. We haven't built a full facility around it. We've just done Tokamaks. There's like 3 Tokamaks in the world plus like 2 lifter facilities. So that's really what we're talking about. So now what we're finding is if we go back to the original DOE paper, which found that in the 1960s, if we don't fund this thing, we won't actually ever achieve fusion. And where if we actually put any reasonable level of funding at it, we would have achieved it decades ago. So literally, if you want to sit there and ask why it is that we don't have clean, renewable energy that is actually stable and functional in any meaningful capacity, take a look at the 1960s U.S. government and say, you guys and everybody forward are assholes.
So
because
blame
we could have
Carter,
had this.
basically.
So by the way, if you want to think of
Carter fucked everything up.
Yeah.
Carter fucked a lot of shit up.
So if you want to think about, like, when he says particle accelerator, what you should think in your mind is SLAC, not LHC. So
Probably,
a linear accelerator is probably
Yes.
what would be used, and
Yes,
you
yes.
wouldn't need a gigantic one necessarily. And we have more advanced materials than even when we made the LHC. So
Yep.
all that would come into play. And by the way, when you're talking about lifters and what kind of material advantages we have or advances we have there, lasers have come a long fucking way.
They've come a long fucking way.
In just the last couple decades, or just the last decade. So, like, we had the ignition experiment, right, which had, was it 190 whatever the hell watts, like, it was like exawatts or some ridiculous amount of energy.
I thought it was gigawatts, but I mean, still,
whatever it was.
It's a massive fucking laser.
No, keep in mind, I was talking about the peak wattage there.
Let's put it this way. The classic cartoon laser of it fires on you and you disappear into dust. We're talking those levels of power.
So I was talking about, like, the peak power. If we're talking about just the raw power going in, it was fucking huge.
It was
So this thing is if you wanted to get rid of a tattoo, you would not have a problem.
Well, I mean,
tattoo's gone.
you would have a problem. Your tattoo would be gone along with most of your arm.
Well, that's what I said.
Pretty much everything else.
You wouldn't have a problem because you wouldn't be there to have a problem anymore.
That's probably true.
Most of you.
So they're trying to fire this whole big ass facility onto a pellet size like smaller than the end of your pinky.
Yes.
And to get that, like, this is why it's not just peak power that's important, it's the power density. They're trying to focus all this shit down to, like, less than the head of a pin, or the point of a pin. And get that energy there to basically do what the Tokamak does in all of its volume inside of this tiny-ass volume, just briefly.
Right. And so
that
theory,
facility can now be shrunk down now, was what I was getting to there.
The theory is that the lifter pellets would be able to be fed at a certain rate, and so we'd basically harvest the energy and feed another pellet and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That being said, that's one of the reasons why I lean more towards Tokamaks. I see that as much more of a sustainable energy output. But either way, I think both the lifter and the Tokamaks have come very, very close to unity in terms of energy. They just haven't quite crossed that threshold. And the day that they do will be absolutely amazing for humankind.
Yeah.
Like, it will.
Imagine a decade where we suddenly come out of nowhere, going out into space and whatever the fuck we want.
Right. We will literally have. I mean, to talk
low
about
energy bills,
fusion energy, a fusion energy powered ship would have the ability to power itself, and then have ramjets take in some of the spare hydrogen that's kicking around in space, because there's tons of hydrogen kicking around in space, and compress that, and then basically eject it out the backside. So you would have starships that are actually capable of long-term transit without refueling, which is stunning.
But crazy.
Yeah. So in any case, what they have been producing is with material science increases, some of the laser technology advancements, they've actually been getting a lot closer to viable fusion, and they're starting to look at private-public partnerships, because literally the first company that comes up with a viable fusion reactor will own and dominate the energy market from now until forever.
So, and if you're looking to, like, get into this field and, like, try to do something that will actually make this happen, the fusion part of it itself is actually pretty well characterized now. I mean, there are advances to be made there, but if you're not technically oriented, there's not going to be something you can get in on very easily, because you're going to have to go through a lot of training in order to figure out, like, you know, the field characteristics. You have to be able to solve these equations and figure out how to manipulate that data.
The
big advance. Yeah. It's fluid dynamics plus electromagnetism plus fuck you.
Right.
Plus nuclear physics.
It's all the shit in physics that you don't actually want to learn about.
So, yeah, and then you have to, you start off with the chemical engineering side and the physics side, and you blend them together, and then you chuck nuclear at it. And then hopefully it explodes and gets more back than you threw in. So, the side that's actually going to probably make this, is probably going to pop this cherry here, is actually going to be the material sciences part of it.
Yes.
And then
they may have already done it.
And then the practical engineering that actually makes it happen. So the first company to, like, get the money and get off their asses and make it happen is going to get it.
Which is one of the reasons why the date for fusion, even though we haven't actually publicly funded it, unlike everything else, has been moved up to in the 2025 to 2030 range before we see a viable fusion plant, which is,
Right.
I mean, 10 years away is a crazy, for commercially viable fusion, in 10 years is a very short timeline. Right,
Yeah.
and the Skunkworks project was one of the first ones, which I think was what you were referencing
So,
with the Pistons.
so the one I was referencing with the Pistons, I'm pretty sure that was a private company, so that does kind of count. But I think it was a public-private partnership. But they just haven't quite cracked it yet with the first run of their system.
I know that I think it was Raytheon and their Skunkworks,
Okay.
and Raytheon Skunkworks had something in 2015 that they thought they would have a viable prototype by 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously they're not going to announce that they have a viable prototype, right?
Right. Oh,
Let's be entirely honest.
Let me just find this Linus Tech Tips video because this is blah 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 fusion reactor or just fusion. Okay, so building real blah blah blah. This is one of his holy shit episodes.
Yeah. But we
then,
are
Linus Tech
on the
Tips
borderline of this, and where Craig was sitting
There you
there
go.
and teasing me a little bit earlier was what is the use of fission reactors, and the answer is
Yeah. Why the fuck would you use it?
breeding the fuel for fusion reactors.
Getting the deuterium. Yeah.
Right. So fundamentally, again, all of that stuff I talked about earlier in the episode associated with neutrons and neutron capture in hydrogenous material, we don't have a lot of deuterium. But
So we actually do, and that's my contention. We have
you
about
have to distill out a ton of seawater.
it's
and this
about
is a
yeah.
massive
But
pain in the ass.
if you've got fusion, then you have no fucking excuse because you've got the energy.
But
that is
at
a
the
fair
same
point.
time, if I was to run a fission plant with a light water reactor,
Why would you spend the material? Why would you do that if you could use the fission materials to send out satellites and shit?
I mean, we might get to the point where we're doing that. But, I mean, realistically, ramjets would eventually provide us enough fusion material for
Yeah, but that requires a much
space travel.
larger device.
Not really. I mean, don't forget, the size of the device versus the size of the engine. The engine is going to be proportional to the size of the device, right? So ultimately, a ramjet is just going to be a scoop. And if we turn around and we attach a magnetic field in the front, we would be able to constrain all of that stuff and basically
your
and force fusion.
Here's your abundance, and I want you to remember, the Earth is very, very, very large. The natural abundance of deuterium is about 1 atom in 6,500.
Okay,
Just
fair enough.
saying, it's very common. Now, tritium, if you wanted to use tritium, that's much less common, but that's 1 in a million or whatever.
I mean, tritium hydrogen reactions are a lot easier than deuterium reactions.
Right. So deuterium and tritium. So I would say that you're probably right as far as stilling out tritium because it's radioactive and it goes away if you make it. But if you wanted to just use deuterium, we've got so fucking much of it. Just think the entire ocean.
We do.
It is more than 1 part in 10,000 in the entire ocean. And you just have to use, if you have cheap electricity, like they do in Norway, you just run distillation over and over again.
All of that's true, right? But then you'd have to centrifuge out the hydrogen compared to its own element. Whereas if you sat there and you took a light water reactor, if you just took a light water reactor and you let it run with the neutrons combining with the hydrogen, you'd produce deuterium and you'd actually have super concentrated reactors. So not only are you getting energy on one side, you're getting energy on the other side. And again, ultimately, nuclear is already cost-effective.
Let me go ahead and give you the AOC argument here.
I mean,
but not as stupid.
I was going to say, try and leave the barista out of it.
Yeah. So let me be the barista that can actually undo a fucking cap on a bottle. So if you wanted to go with zero nuclear waste, then you just use the electricity to boil off water until you got down to the deuterium oxide.
And
that's literally what Norway did during the Second World War, pre-Second World War, to produce all the deuterium we needed over in the U.S.
And you probably could get there. You realistically, so when we start talking about why is it that fusion is a better reactor choice than fission, assuming that we actually had a viable reactor?
Right.
The reason is when you initiate a fusion reaction still produces neutron radiation, but it doesn't really produce any waste. Right? You're pretty much going to get a neutron and a stable helium isotope.
Now, unless you get helium-3, say off the moon, and then use that to produce just helium and electricity.
I mean, at the end of the day...
Which would be cool, but, like, you'd have to go to the fucking moon to get it. Like, who's going to do that?
Once we get over the threshold of energy fusion with hydrogen, we're going to eventually... The next tier or the next stage of fusion reactions are going to be fusion reactors that have the ability to take the helium that's produced in the reactor and convert it one step higher into...
lithium and other shit.
Lithium and other shit, all the way up to about iron. Right, and that's really like the advancement that's going to end up happening.
Right. So that's the big thing you do there is you get a lot of fundamental ingredients that are available, and then you can push it even further because then you have supply and demand issues, right?
Yep.
If you wanted to get to, say, your transition metals, if you had now, this would be a really fucking slow way to do it so far. If you wanted, and it would be very, very, very energy intensive to go, especially past iron. To the point where you may as well just mine the shit. But supposing you needed it in situ in small quantities for God knows what reason, you could theoretically spend the energy to push past iron and create your transition metals, basically the rest of your periodic table to do whatever the fuck you want.
In reality, right? So in reality,
harder to do some of these parts, but most of the parts you can get to.
When we start talking about fission reactors, right? This is where fission reactors would come into play.
Sure.
Well, again, we're still burning an isotope that has absolutely zero purpose outside of being burned as fuel, right? And we're producing a whole bunch of byproducts of this that can be then used in reactors for a variety of things. Not only that, but in the case of a fusion reactor...
the waste, couldn't it?
What's that?
You could probably zap fry the waste, couldn't you?
You for the most part, you can. Actually, in a fission reaction, because there's excess neutrons, a lot of the really, really hazardous components go away, and so you're left with this very not so dangerous compound afterwards. But that's again exposed to a huge neutron field of flux. So what are the other reasons that we could use neutron reactors? Which there's going to be some neutrons produced in a fusion reaction, but those would almost be like a pure... So you can think of it like a fission is almost a dirty reactor, and a fusion reactor is a clean reactor. Yes, you want that for energy, but there's other reasons that we would possibly want to run a fission reactor, which are including things like breeding medical isotopes. Having a reactor that can not only produce energy, but can also have an excess of neutrons that will allow a stable creation of technetium-99 or...
So technetium-99 is very important. So it's usually denoted technetium-99M. That just means medical grade. No.
Oh, it means metastable. It means metastable.
Okay.
For those of you out there who are going to get upset about this, good. So technetium-99M is very important in medicine. And as being a person who's had the recipient of one of these, they're used in renograms. In fact, it's funny. So UF just down the road,
a lot of different things.
So UF just down the road, I had gotten a renogram there before. This was back when they had their half kilogram of plutonium in their reactor there. So I was able to get. So the technetium is only good for like 6 hours after they pull it.
That's typically good. That's typical for most
6 to 8 hours.
Yeah.
So that's the time window they have to bring it down to the hospital and give it to you. And there's only so many places in the U.S. that produce this stuff, so they're flying it around the country.
Yep.
And I was lucky because it was literally like a quarter mile away is where the stuff that they put into me came from. So, you get the fresh shit there.
Oh, yeah.
But
after all the same shit when they put it in.
So while I was actually at uni there, they came and took the half kilogram of plutonium away because of national security concerns.
Well, and that's kind of the thing is ultimately. So I had a proposed reactor design that I wanted to use for molten salt reactors, and it would use basically the way I wanted to design it was, and I have no idea whether it would work. I'd actually have to go build an MCNP analysis.
No, you'd have to.
I've already bitched enough about that. But the premise is, so we have, in chemical engineering, we know of two types of reactors, right? One is known as a CSTR and one is known as a PFR.
Okay, there's more reactors than that, but that's the ones you learn.
Whatever. We're going to call it the CSTR and a PFR. for simplicity, right? And these are very broad concepts. So the CSTR is basically a tank. It's a continuously stirred tank, and so you feed in an input and out goes an output, and that's your CSTR. Your PFR is basically a CSTR but over a longer distance.
Or you just think of it as a pipe.
Kind of like a pipe, yes. So a PFR has the advantage that it can react over a longer period of time. What I wanted to do was what you see with most molten salt designs is they are designed as CSTRs, wherein they're basically they react all the stuff in their core, and then they pump some of the superfluid up into the steam generator, spit out the steam, and then go back into their thing and go through the reaction.
Right.
I wanted to use a PFR, which would allow if you did kind of like a cheese wheel, like a holy cheese wheel design, you could have the outer edge of it pump in one thing, and then that get diverted toward the center core. So you could basically do breeder reactions on the outside edge of the core, which would be advantageous. That gets pumped back into the center of the core, which is where the final reactions are going to happen. And then if you wanted to actually use, say, medical isotope breeder, you could have a couple of those lines dedicated to medical isotope breeders, and then you just
not metastable then.
That. Metastable is a term associated.
I'm gonna keep fucking with you.
Okay.
Hey, it's not like you don't give it to me, all right?
So metastable means essentially that it has a very short existence before decaying onto something else. So it's kind of like it sort of exists, but it doesn't really exist. So you
kind of like that disease you think you have.
What's that?
It's kind of like that disease you think you have. Whoever's listening.
Wow, I think you're projecting a little bit there, Mr. Craig.
Yeah, it could be.
You've never had to deal with second year syndrome, people, have you? It's the funniest fucking thing. Okay, so med school. Second year, they go through all the infectious diseases and things.
Yeah.
And so everybody suddenly has something.
Inherited hypochondriacism, huh?
It's when all the students get to learn about why you shouldn't self-diagnose.
Got it.
Fair enough.
So second year syndrome is, the funny thing is my older brother correctly diagnosed something himself. It was like the first time his professor heard about that. It's like, well, heard of a student doing it, not heard of the disease. It was bursitis or whatever. But like he correctly diagnosed it, and his professor's just like, yeah, you got it right.
Huh.
Yeah, big, very big climax there, but people who go through that shit, second year syndrome, everybody's like, I have a zebra. Like, no, you don't. You don't have anything. You're just healthy. You weird person in a fucking coat.
But yeah, the goal would be that would be the goal of my design for those reactors, and that's the reason that we would still use fission reactors is for a lot of these odd things where we need neutron flux fields, because as much as neutrons are produced from deuterium tritium reactions or deuterium reactions, right? There's a lot less neutrons per unit mass used than, say, a fission reaction, where for every fission of a uranium-235, for instance, I get 2.4 neutrons, right?
Now, here's another thing to be clear on that. So neutrons, by the way, are not stable. They're particle accelerators that specifically produce neutrons. There are neutron sources at different national labs that are used all the time in research, specifically because neutrons are not stable particles outside of confinement.
They're pretty stable.
So, outside of confinement, they are not stable.
I mean, they're pretty stable. Like the problem is
they decay into protons pretty readily.
Not really.
So the point is, so you put, if you do a neutron scattering experiment, how do you think they pick up where the thing was and what's scattered off of it?
Well, I mean that's actually pretty easy, right? So you'll do so typically a neutron source is going to be an alpha particle emitter combined with a lower level element. So lithium americium, for instance, plutonium, beryllium sources. So if it emits an alpha particle has 2 protons and 2 neutrons.
Right. And
it combines with these lower tier elements, it moves them up in the scale. And PUB sources are much better than americium lithium I know that sounds kind of funny, but the plutonium beryllium sources. They'll have a whole bunch
we're
of
all
plutonium.
children. Laugh.
Right. So the plutonium will emit an alpha particle, and the alpha particle will go into the beryllium, and that'll move beryllium into from basically, so it's element number 3, with what, like 6-ish, something like that, and it'll move it to 6-ish neutrons. Typically, it's like 2-to-1 neutron ratio, but that'll actually put it into it'll bump it up from beryllium to what's 5? Boron?
Yes.
Boron, I think it is. So we'll bump it up to boron and
all right. To what end?
It'll be like, what's that?
To what end?
So the point is that the boron is unstable. So it produces
and then the momentum goes in the same direction because momentum is the idea at the end here.
So what ends up happening is the boron then decays and it emits a neutron, right? To bring it down to a stable isotope.
And because one question you might have immediately is how do you direct neutrons? You don't direct the neutrons, you direct the alpha that comes out of it.
Well, what you'll end up doing to shield you'll shield the portion of neutrons that you don't need.
I was gonna say, or you could just do the other approach, which is just kind of to close off everything else. So the national labs neutron sources, generally speaking, that are going to be used for like product testing or physics experiments are going to be accelerator based, and they use a target at the end to produce neutrons.
That's probably true.
So the thing is, so they produce a pretty well collimated beam, and they're fucking expensive to get time on. You have to set your entire experiment up in this little ass room right at the end of this big ass thing.
So it'll still be just like everything else, but the difference is that when you emit the alpha particle, it'll go into an electrically controlled channel. Basically. And so it'll be fired. So basically, the alpha particle will be emitted in any random direction, and some of them will be captured by the EM field that is aimed at a target on the other end. And so it'll be accelerated to the target. It'll hit the target, and then they can actually produce some stuff that's not traditional neutron source material.
So the idea is that you get a collimated beam of neutrons. You get neutrons within a certain energy range, and you know exactly where they're going to go. Yep. And you can get reasonably high neutron fluxes out of these. And this is one of the reasons they're so goddamn expensive to use is for the time is because they have an entire accelerator attached. But the point is, so actually, Thunderfoot before he went bonkers had a pretty good video of him putting a it wasn't a GoPro, it was a little handheld camera thing into one of these into the beam because he had some extra time on an experiment he was doing over in Euroland.
That would have burned out the camera.
It burned out the camera.
It would burn a fucking hole through it. So here's the thing. Neutrons are not stable outside of confinement, and confinement would be any nucleus. So they do decay, and when they decay, when they strike something, they will probably convert it or explode it. But that's a very small cross section here. We're talking. You have to have a pretty high flux to make sure you get those targets if you do it that way. So typically
neutrons,
no, they don't really decay. They scatter. So they'll scatter and they will change into alternative forms. Again, if you have hydrogenous media, which is realistically everything that is surrounding the GoPro.
A free neutron has a half-life of 10.2 minutes.
10.2 minutes. I guess that's
10.2 minutes.
I guess in the grand scheme of things, that's pretty long.
No,
that is fairly
long for particles. That is an eon if you're trying to do like a physics experiment. So this is where the scattering.
For the most part, for like a radiation and shielding perspective, that's more than enough time because it'll take next to no time to actually hit you.
So this is why I was saying, how do you think that they detect these things? What they detect is decay products post-scattering, which is not huge. You know, and you're getting oblique angle. This is similar to SAX, small angle X-ray scattering, but much higher energies that you can achieve. without having to do crazy shit like gamma rays. You can actually direct where a neutron is going to go based off the beam prior to the target.
I feel like this might be a topic worth going into on its own because I'm so deep into this. I'm kind of lost with everything you guys have shared with me right now.
So when we start talking about like 10 minutes is a really long. If you have
a
neutron travels a very long distance.
Amazing amount of time.
Minutes.
Yeah.
It travels a really long distance. So by the time we start talking about like practical things that we're dealing with, over 10 minutes, neutrons will be through you, through the wall behind you, and several probably. It wouldn't surprise me.
So just to give you an idea on the Thunderfoot video,
when he
put the camera into the beam, and they use that for the remaining time. Just to give you an idea of like how many decays you're going to be getting. It's very few given the neutron flux, and what you see on film is when the neutron decays prior to hitting a pixel, it affects the amount of charge in the pixel because they cycle through and they check how much charge is in a little capacitor basically. So what happens is it basically fills the capacitor all the way up and you see a white pixel. So you saw a little bit of white static in the image of the camera before it just died. Just from having the internals beat up a little bit. So that if you're ever wondering, for instance, when you're sitting there at night and or if you close your eyes and you see like a white spark on occasion, sometimes that's a cosmic ray decaying in your eyeball. Again, not very common, but it'd be a bright pinprick out of nowhere.
Man, that's a really cool spot to close out on, actually. Us being all stardust, and, sometimes you can actually see that.
Bah humbug!
You gotta shut us up.
Humbug indeed, right? But, people have only got so much time, and besides, we will be back next week.
Screw the hippies!
It's 2:30, man.
So what? Fight the power.
Yeah,
Fight the coming dawn.
Fuck you, Dawn.
Rail against the dying of the light as well. Understood, but...
Oh no, the light died many moons ago.
Well, you can still rail against the dark. It's probably better that you do anyway. But we'll be back, no worries, with plenty more to discuss. There's too much going on. So, we'll talk to you again soon. Keep your, I've been saying this every week, but, I mean, really, keep your powder dry and keep your ears to the ground and be safe out there. It's a crazy world. Talk to you soon.
I just imagine a whole bunch of listeners going outside and put their ears to the ground, and it's fucking snowing outside.